The man known to history as Vlad the Impaler, Vlad III, or Vlad Dracula, was possibly born in November or December of 1431 in the citadel of Sighisoara in the Principality or Voivodeship of Wallachia, which today lies in modern-day Romania. However, there is no certainty in this, such is the lack of substantial records for the time and place, and it is also possible that he was born at some stage in the late 1420s. Vlad's father was Prince Vlad II, ruler of Wallachia, the illegitimate son of Prince Mircea I, the Brave of Wallachia. The identity of Vlad the Impaler's mother is not known for certain, but many historians believe she was Vlad II's first wife, Kniazna, also called Eupraxia of Moldavia, the eldest daughter of Prince Alexander the Good. Alternatively, Vlad the Impaler could also have been conceived by one of Vlad II's mistresses, but there is no way of knowing for sure. Yet regardless of who his biological mother really was, Vlad was regarded as a legitimate son of Vlad II, also known as Vlad Dracula. Vlad the Impaler's early life, and indeed much of his subsequent career, can be examined best by looking closely at that of his father. Vlad II's early years were not well documented, but he was most likely kept as a hostage in the care of the Hungarian and German courts of the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund I in the 1400s and 1410s. Hostages, or pledges, as they were more often known at the time, were a regular feature of political life in 15th century Europe. These were used to secure the faithfulness of a follower by keeping a family member at the court of their liege lord. It was also a way to maintain the association between noble families and build relationships. For Vlad the Impaler's grandfather, Mircea I, Vlad II's father, it allowed him to gain further access to the royal courts of Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire, as well as securing a more opportunistic future for his illegitimate son. Conversely, for Sigismund, it allowed him to ensure the loyalty of the Voivodeship of Wallachia on the eastern borders of the Kingdom of Hungary. As a consequence of the arrangement, Vlad II was educated as a nobleman at the Hungarian court, and most likely converted from Eastern Orthodoxy to Roman Catholicism, the standard faith of the Holy Roman Empire, while he was staying in Hungary or the German states. After Mircea I's death in 1418, Vlad II was no longer required to remain at the court of Emperor Sigismund, but chose instead to stay on as the emperor's page, allowing him to further his chivalric and aristocratic education. His half-brother Michael, or Michael I, succeeded their father back home in Wallachia, but Michael himself died shortly thereafter in 1420. At this juncture, Vlad II turned his focus on acquiring the Voivodeship of Wallachia for himself, competing with his surviving family members as well as the other illegitimate children of Mircea for the title. It is worth assessing the political landscape of southeastern Europe, the region in which Vlad II and Vlad the Impaler would operate throughout their lives at this juncture. For centuries, the Balkans region had been largely dominated by the Byzantine Empire, the name for the state which had survived from the Eastern Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean after the Western Roman Empire was overrun and collapsed in the 5th century. But the Byzantine Empire was on its knees by the late 14th and early 15th centuries, controlling little more than the city of Constantinople, the city known as Istanbul today, guarding the gateway between Europe and Asia, as well as some small territories in Greece. Much of its other territories in regions such as Anatolia in western Turkey, Thrace, Bulgaria, and Macedonia had been conquered by the rising power in the region, the Ottoman Turks, a Muslim power who had expanded out of the region approximating to modern-day Turkey. Further to the northwest, the main power was the Christian Kingdom of Hungary, the ruler of which was Emperor Sigismund, at whose court Vlad II was a pledge for so many years. And then, between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were several smaller states such as the Kingdom of Serbia, the Kingdom of Bosnia, the Voivodeship of Wallachia, and the Principality of Transylvania, the latter two constituting much of modern-day Romania. In the 15th century, there were two processes playing out across the region. Firstly, the Ottomans were set on capturing Constantinople and bringing the long-lived Byzantine Empire to an end. Secondly, the Ottoman sultans wished to expand further northwest into Christian Europe. In the process, the buffer states on Hungary's eastern and southern borders, such as the voivodeship of Wallachia, would become key battlegrounds during the 15th century in the fight against Ottoman expansion. Indeed, fighting had occurred at the Battle of Kosovo in June 1389, when the Ottomans clashed in a bloody but indecisive battle against the Serbs, Bosnians, and other Christian powers in the Balkans. In the aftermath of this, the Serbs were weakened to the extent that they largely became vassals of the Ottomans. At the time of Vlad III's birth, around 1431, Wallachia was still largely a client principality of the Kingdom of Hungary, but this was increasingly challenged by the Ottomans, and many of the boyars or nobles of Wallachia were considering which side it would be best to be on. As the Turkish expansion continued, both Vlad the Impaler and Vlad II would be highly involved in these affairs. The population of the Principality of Wallachia was just as distinctive as its geography, made up of different cultures including Transylvanians, Slovaks, Germans, Greeks, Hungarians, Roma, Slavs, Jews and Turks, and followers of various religions including Eastern Orthodoxy and Christianity, but there were also Protestants, Jews, Muslims, pagans and Catholics. The land and its people were battle-scarred, hardened by the continual fighting, external pressures and internal upheaval from serving as the field upon which wars were fought by the Islamic and Christian armies for the fate of Europe. As an illegitimate son of Mircea I, Vlad II was not directly in line for the throne following his half-brother's death in 1420, but he would ultimately reign as voivoda twice, firstly from 1436 till 1442, and again from 1443 until his death in 1447. But at the time of Vlad the Impaler's birth, this all lay ahead, and at that juncture Vlad II was assigned by the Hungarian nobles to serve at Sighisoara to defend the region against any possible Ottoman incursions. His task was to defend the mountain passes from Transylvania into Wallachia from enemy raids, particularly from the Ottoman Empire, a powerful Islamic realm. If Wallachia fell to the Ottoman threat, this would potentially open the rest of Europe to a massive assault by the Islamic forces, weakening the Christian states. Upon coming to power in 1436, Vlad II found himself at a precarious crossroads, his principality torn between the growing strength of the Islamic Ottomans and the divisive factions of the Catholic European court. Vlad Dracula was expected to side with his fellow Christians against the Turks, who had already taken much of the Orthodox lands of the Byzantine Empire. In 1431, the same year Vlad the Impaler was born, his father was inducted into the chivalric Order of the Dragon, a military order founded by Emperor Sigismund in 1408. The order was responsible for protecting Christian lands from their many enemies, particularly from the Ottoman Turks to the southeast. As a result of becoming a member of this prestigious order, Vlad II received the cognomen Dracul, derived from the word drac or dragon, although in modern Romanian, drac translates to the word devil. Vlad II Dracul would have several children, 3 legitimate sons, Mircea II, Vlad III, and Radu the Handsome, and at least 1 illegitimate son, Vlad the Monk. The sons all received the sobriquet named Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, after Vlad II had been inducted into the Order of the Dragon. Dracula would become a synonymous moniker for Vlad the Impaler and a title he would proudly bear throughout his life, in contrast with modern times in which the name Dracula has become synonymous with evil. At the age of 5, Vlad Dracula, in line with his family's position as one of the bulwarks of Christian rule in the Balkans, protecting against the Ottoman advance, began training for knighthood at Târgoviște, learning the skills expected of a boyar's son, including jousting, horsemanship, court etiquette, archery, strategy, swimming, hunting, tracking, and combat training. Vlad excelled at these activities and seemed to thrive during the intensive physical training, building the foundation for his upcoming military career. It would serve him well in his future career as Prince of Wallachia and as a commander, leading soldiers and volunteers against his many enemies. He would also have become familiar at an early age with the new firearms and cannons which were beginning to be introduced into Europe's armies and which would transform the nature of warfare in this highly militarized part of the world in the years ahead. As second son of Vlad II, the young Vlad Dracula was raised in an aristocratic household alongside his siblings, educated as was appropriate for all young boyars or nobles of the period, studying reading, philosophy, writing, mathematics, the classics, and different languages under the tutelage of noblewomen, tutors, and courtiers. Vlad was most likely raised under the Eastern Orthodox faith and was also taught history, politics, and the delicate nature of Wallachia and its place in the larger scheme of matters of land, faith, and war. Following the deaths in quick succession of Emperor Sigismund in 1437, and then his successor as Holy Roman Emperor and King of Hungary, Albert II, on the 27th of October 1439, the Hungarian nobles voted Władysław III of Poland in as the new King of Hungary. The following year, Władysław chose a Hungarian boyar and military commander, John Hunyadi, also known as Janku of Hunedoara, to serve as voivoda of Transylvania. Hunyadi sought to continue Hungarian influence in Wallachia and demanded that Vlad II take part in his ongoing efforts to resist the Ottoman advance northwest. Conversely, the Turks were seeking to invade the Principality of Transylvania at this time and asked the Wallachians to assist them. Vlad II ignored the Ottomans, turning to serve alongside the Hungarians and Transylvanians. John Hunyadi, Vlad II and their allies successfully pacified the eastern counties, pushing the Turks back and ultimately reinstating the protection of Hungary's southern border in March 1442, when the future Vlad the Impaler was still only in his early teens. Vlad II was promptly accused of treason by the Ottomans for helping the Hungarians and faced reprisals. Shortly after his shared victory over the Turks, Vlad Dracula brought his sons Vlad and Radu to the court of Sultan Murad II, and all of them were immediately imprisoned by the Ottomans and held until a new alliance could be arranged between Vlad II and the Turks. The Sultan demanded payment and a show of loyalty, so Vlad Dracula could redeem himself in the eyes of the Turks for his efforts. He reluctantly agreed, handing over his sons to the Sultan as hostages until the debt was repaid to the Ottomans. All of this highlights the increasing difficulties faced by the nobles of Wallachia in this period, caught as they were between two powers, the King of Hungary and the Ottoman Sultan, who both viewed the Wallachians as their subjects. Vlad II returned to Wallachia from the Ottoman court, having left his sons behind as pledges, only to find that he had been replaced with Basarab, Dracula's cousin, by John Hunyadi during his absence. Hunyadi then turned his focus on the approaching Ottoman army and defeated them in August 1442, following the Turk attempt to annex Wallachia. Vlad Dracula tried to remain neutral during the period of his son's imprisonment and hoped to see them released shortly after, while he also sought during the mid-1440s to build a relationship between the Turks and the Christians of Wallachia and Hungary, hoping for a diplomatic resolution to the growing tensions which Wallachia had become the epicenter of. In the course of the mid-1440s, Vlad II Dracula's compromised position, in which his sons were effectively being held as surety for his good behavior by the Ottomans, was eventually uncovered in Buda, the Hungarian capital, infuriating the Hungarians who, under the command of Hunyadi, led an attack against Vlad II, forcing his eldest son Mircea to flee. With the aid of the Ottomans, Vlad II was able to overthrow the Hungarians and retake Wallachia, but his success was short-lived. The boyars, led by a cousin of Vlad's, confusingly called Vladislav, overthrew him and sought to gain aid from John Hunyadi to prevent Vlad Dracula from returning. The coup by the boyars resulted in Vlad II having to raise an army with the help of the Ottomans who had remained behind and to recruit from Wallachia. Hunyadi and his forces arrived, and in 1447, the Hungarians, Transylvanians, and the Wallachian boyars, led by Vladislav, defeated Vlad Dracula and Mircea's armies, capturing Mircea. Mircea was subsequently tortured, having his eyes burned out and then being buried alive. Vlad Dracula returned to avenge his son, but was captured and executed shortly after, most likely either by being beheaded or burned at the stake at some point in November 1447. It is generally believed that Vlad Dracula was betrayed in this instance by his cousin Vladislav, who subsequently succeeded to the voivodeship as Vladislav II in 1447. This background of political intrigue and internecine conflict, both within Wallachia and the wider Balkans, would inform all of Vlad the Impaler's own career. He and his brother Radu had been left in the care of Sultan Murad II, who treated the children well despite their status as prisoners. The boys most likely witnessed the brutality that the Turks could inflict on their captives during the 1440s, and were advised to remain obedient. According to many historical sources, the positive treatment of Vlad and Radu by the Sultan was due to their being regarded as guests rather than prisoners, in much the same way as their father had been well treated as a pledge at the court of Emperor Sigismund over 30 years earlier. The goal of such positive treatment was to engender the loyalty of the Wallachian princes and ensure that they would one day return to Wallachia and rule the voivodeship as pro-Ottoman rulers who would ally with the Turks against the Hungarians and their allies. However, Vlad would prove impervious to these efforts to win him over. Vlad III and Radu Dracula continued their studies at the Ottoman court at the Egrigos citadel in the Anatolian plateau, located in what is today central Turkey. Despite their Christian background, the brothers studied the Quran, as well as literature and the Persian and Turkish languages, receiving the traditional education of noblemen, which included logic, warfare, philosophy, combat, and horseback riding. Vlad threw himself into the fighting arts, his hatred for the Turks seeming to drive his training, focusing on his ultimate goal to become voivoda of Wallachia and annihilate the Ottomans. Despite the Ottomans' efforts to control the Wallachian princes, Vlad fiercely resisted and was subjected to brutal punishment as a result. Radu, conversely, embraced his experience with the Turks, converting to Islam and later volunteering to serve as a janissary, the elite household guards of the Ottoman sultans, who were usually former Christians who had converted to Islam and were also circumcised as part of the process. In this position, Radu grew close to the sultan's son and heir, Mehmed II, who he would go on to serve later in his life. As a result of their closeness, rumors even spread in later years that the two were lovers. Radu's conversion, closeness with Mehmed II, and admiration for Ottoman culture infuriated Vlad Dracula and fueled his hate for the Ottomans. After the death of his father and older brother at the hands of the Hungarians, Vlad Dracula now found himself to be the heir to his family's position within Wallachia, and with it a serious contender to claim voivodeship through the elective vote of the Wallachian nobles, the boyars. Moreover, the death of his father released Vlad and Radu from their captors, while Radu remained behind in Anatolia at this juncture to continue his service with the Turks. Vlad swore to avenge his family, as he perceived that his father and brother had perished as a result of Ottoman interference in Wallachia, and his half-brother was lost to him as someone who had Islamicized at the Ottoman court. But before he acquired his revenge, he needed an army. To prevent the Hungarians from taking over Wallachia following Vlad II's death, the Turks, ironically enough, provided Vlad III Dracula with the army he needed to begin acquiring power back in Wallachia. No doubt the Sultan believed that he was effectively arming a vassal prince when he did so, though the Turks would learn in due course that this was certainly not the case. Armed with this Ottoman support, Vlad was able to seize power in Wallachia in 1448, when he was perhaps no more than 17 years of age, certainly no more than 21. He successfully deposed his cousin Vladislav II at this juncture, during a period when Vladislav was battling the Ottomans to the south. One of Vlad's first fabled acts as prince was to invite many of the boyars who may have been involved in his father and brother's death to a feast. According to some sources, he then had his men stab them and take them to be impaled as a show of strength, although the truth of these claims is not certain. Vlad III Dracula was only in power for a matter of months as Prince of Wallachia when he was ousted again by the Hungarians, Transylvanians and Wallachians, and his cousin Vladislav II was yet again reinstated as voivoda after he had returned from his campaign against the Turks. Vlad was consequently forced briefly into exile, settling in neighboring Moldavia in order to avoid further problems at home. While in Moldavia, Vlad spent time in the company of his uncle, Prince Bogdan II, and his cousin, Prince Stephen, until Bogdan was assassinated in October of 1451 by Petru Aron, Bogdan's brother. Vlad and Stephen fled to Transylvania through the Borgo Pass, where the two men eventually fell into the care of John Hunyadi and the Prince of Hungary, Ladislaus. Hunyadi had previously suffered some significant losses in Kosovo and Varna over the course of the past couple of years, costing him influence, power and prestige. He had lost two of his titles, those of Viceroy of Hungary and Governor of Transylvania, and was facing further distrust from the Hungarian Diet or Parliamentary Assembly. These setbacks aside, he maintained several estates throughout his domain and still commanded a mighty military force which he could call upon at short notice. Hunyadi decided to show Vlad mercy despite his recent transgressions, knowing Dracula's hatred could be useful if targeted at the Turks. Furthermore, Vlad's intimate knowledge of the Ottoman Empire, having spent years at the Sultan's court, could make him a significant and invaluable advisor for Hunyadi if courted correctly, while the shared hatred for the Turks of Hunyadi and Vlad, as well as the growing disillusionment between Hunyadi and Vladislav, may have also been a contributing factor in the truce. Hunyadi, who was of course responsible for the death of Vlad's father and brother, needed allies, and Vlad needed protection. Each could provide the other with exactly what they required in the short term. It is not known for sure whether a genuine peace had been reached or whether there was simply a mutual understanding of Vlad and Hunyadi's need for each other. When Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne in January of 1451, Vladislav sent congratulations to the new Sultan and restarted the two-sided alliance between Wallachia and its neighbors, extending its hospitality and service to both the enemy realms of the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. This arrangement both protected and threatened Wallachia, but gave Hunyadi an opportunity he could extend to Vlad Dracula to help him fight the Turks. Vlad was offered a military posting under Hunyadi and also granted a place at his court. Hunyadi brought the young man with him to the Hungarian Diet and continued to instruct him in the arts of war and to further his nobleman's education. Dracula swore fealty to Ladislaus when he was crowned as King of Hungary, and Hunyadi was able to make peace with his former enemy Count Ulrich Chili, a supporter of the new Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III and relative of the previous Emperor Sigismund. Meanwhile, while Vlad's influence amongst the Hungarians was growing in the late 1440s and early 1450s, his rival for power in Wallachia, his cousin Vladislav II, was finding his own position compromised during these years. In October 1448, another major battle had occurred between the Ottomans on the one hand and the Hungarians and their allies at Kosovo. The campaign had been led by John Hunyadi as a kind of religious crusade, including contingents of German mercenaries. Vladislav did not send any aid personally, despite the appearance of some 8,000 Wallachians on the field of battle in autumn. The battle ended in a crushing defeat for Hunyadi and his allies, opening the way for the Ottomans to initiate a final assault on Constantinople without fearing any major military unrest in the Balkans in the years that followed. For his part, Hunyadi never forgave Vladislav for his betrayal. A diplomatic and trade war was consequently initiated by Hungary and Transylvania against Wallachia in the years that followed, and the Hungarian commander was increasingly in favor of having Vladislav removed from the voivodeship and replaced by Vlad Dracula. 5 years later came the seismic event in the expansion of Ottoman power in southeastern Europe. On the 29th of May 1453, under the command of Sultan Mehmed II, the Ottoman Empire conquered the city of Constantinople, ultimately destroying the remnants of the Byzantine Empire and establishing the Ottoman Empire's capital there. The great church of Hagia Sophia, which had been built as a Christian cathedral over 900 years earlier, was converted into a mosque. The fall of Constantinople to the Turks, who wielded a mighty army that went unrivaled across the continent, opened up the possibility that the Sultan Mehmed II could now threaten much of southeastern Europe, and John Hunyadi was advised that, because of Vladislav's relationship with the Sultan, the next assault on European lands would probably fall on Belgrade. If Belgrade fell, this would open the Kingdom of Hungary to further assaults by the Turks, especially by the Turkish fleet, which could use the Danube to sail into the cities of Vienna and Buda. In the winter of 1455 to 1456, the Ottoman army was raised near the fortress of Adrianople, or what is today Edirne in northwest Turkey. St. John of Capistrano, a Minorite Franciscan monk who would later be canonized by the Catholic Church, spoke at Győr, Hungary, and inspired others to action against the Ottomans, exclaiming, "God wills it that we chase the Turks out of Europe." Such words had rallied millions to crusade over the course of the past 4 centuries, and Hunyadi, Vlad, and Hunyadi's son Laszlo had been in attendance, moved by the call for a new crusade against the impending invasion of the Ottomans. Vlad was instructed to stay in Transylvania and given permission to launch attacks against Vladislav II, which would potentially alleviate pressures on Belgrade and pull Ottoman focus away from their objectives in the city. Vlad was more than happy to oblige. Vlad led several excursions throughout Wallachia and Transylvania to harass and overwhelm Vladislav, who found himself combating both the standing armies and recuperating from small skirmishes. These culminated in a meeting at the market town of Tarksor on the 20th of August 1456. Here, Vlad the Impaler met Vladislav on the field of battle as their armies prepared to fight one another. But before a wider clash erupted, Vlad rode across the field and challenged his foe to hand-to-hand combat. Vladislav agreed, and in the clash which ensued, Dracula killed Vladislav II. Thus, after nearly 9 years, he had finally avenged himself on the man who had overthrown and killed his father and brother. In the days that followed, Vlad regained the voivodeship of Wallachia and established himself as the undisputed ruler of the principality. Upon taking up the crown of Wallachia, Vlad took the title Prince Vlad, son of Vlad the Great, sovereign, and ruler of Ungru-Wallachia and the duchies of Amlash and Fagarash. The duchies had been granted to him by King Ladislaus for returning to his favor. He worked with local mayors in Transylvania and Hunyadi's son Laszlo, the new commander of Belgrade, to establish a relationship with them and protect his borders. To the north, he tried to incite the boyars to revolt against his Moldavian enemy Petru Aron, another local Balkan prince who, like Vladislav II, had thrown in his lot some years earlier with the Ottomans. In 1457, just a few months after acquiring control of Wallachia, Vlad's cousin Stephen was also successfully installed in Moldavia, following the overthrow of Petru Aron there, and thanks to the dissidents Vlad had aroused with the boyars and a troop of around 6,000 Wallachians. By now, Vlad began to develop his identity as both a violent and strict leader, as well as a strong commander. With a mind for social and economic preservation of the Wallachian state, he bolstered the military and economy and rebuilt villages to allow local merchants to thrive, while restricting foreign trade to help the local market to grow. The Ottomans sent emissaries to Vlad Dracula following his rise to power in an attempt to acquire tribute and a free passage through Wallachia for their troops as a show of loyalty to the Turks. But Vlad refused to travel to Constantinople to pay homage to the Sultan. It is around this time he rebuilt some of the walls around his cities and fortifications, and also began to embrace the practice of impalement as punishment, a common practice used to execute prisoners and traitors of the Ottoman Empire, something he must have witnessed as a young hostage. The first targets of Vlad's wrath were those responsible for the death of his brother and father, particularly the boyars in Wallachia and Transylvania. He seized their assets, lands and other commodities, which he then redistributed to his allies, and captured his enemies and brought them into his custody. The boyars were then executed, mainly through the process of impalement, and their bodies were propped up around his realm as a warning. His methods were both a message to his foes and a means to eliminate those who had dared to challenge him. Other methods of torturous death Vlad had allegedly carried out included allowing animals to feast on his victims, exposing them to the elements, burning them alive, cutting off body parts such as fingers, toes, limbs, eyes, ears, noses, tongues, breasts, nipples, penises, etc., skinning them alive, and boiling. It was said he would sometimes feast while people were impaled or tortured, reveling while people died around him. If we are to believe the tales of Vlad the Impaler's beastly behavior, then women were subjected to some of the worst abuses at the hands of the prince, particularly with respect to their sexual fidelity. If a woman was discovered to have had an affair while married, or had been promiscuous while unmarried or widowed, Vlad apparently treated them to especially severe punishments, including mutilation and impalement on a hot poker while their lovers watched in horror. The paramours would often be made to be involved in the torture, forced to consume the mutilated body parts while their partner bled out. How much of this supposed behavior should be literally believed is open to interpretation. Much of it may have been the fanciful imagination of writers in the more civilized climes of Vienna and Buda, writing about a supposedly savage border lord far away in Wallachia. Some of this brutality is more attestable. For instance, Vlad was especially violent towards foreign peoples on his lands. There were populations of Saxons or Germans from the southeastern region bordering on what is today Poland and the Czech Republic, who settled throughout the Wallachian Principality and served as a separate community within the realm. In one notable story, Vlad learned that a Wallachian merchant in the city of Brasov had his goods taken by Saxon merchants who had refused to pay him. Vlad allegedly had all the Saxons in Brasov rounded up and impaled for their treachery towards a Wallachian citizen. The extent of this is again unclear, but there were extensive pogroms of the Saxons in Wallachia around the mid-16th century. Legends surround Vlad Dracula pertaining to his cruelties, but also to how much his own people feared his wrath. One famous story concerned the Golden Cup, a magnificent chalice that was placed in the town square of his capital, Târgoviște, in plain view of all who passed by. The statute of the golden goblet was simple. Anyone could use it to drink from, but the cup could never leave the confines of the square. At the time, there were around 60,000 individuals living in Târgoviște. The cup was never taken during Vlad's reign. Such was the fear he is believed to have inspired in his subjects. Vlad was also said to have been faced with a large population of poor individuals and had to come up with a means of ending poverty in Wallachia. To do so, Vlad supposedly invited hundreds of the impoverished from Târgoviște to a massive feast where they reveled in the generosity of their prince and ate and drank to their heart's content. Vlad responded by locking the doors of the hall and setting it ablaze. No one escaped. These stories became commonplace and were sensationalized by the Turks, Saxons, Hungarians, Transylvanians, and other enemies Vlad made over the course of his life. While his subjects became all too familiar with his punishments, Vlad the Impaler also showed a deep devotion to military and political deeds, such as helping his cousin Prince Stephen take the Moldavian throne in 1457, providing about 6,000 cavalrymen to fight against Petru Aron. Stephen, in return, helped Vlad combat the continual raids and attacks by the Ottomans against the southern border of Wallachia, attacks which were initiated by the Sultan Mehmed II in response to the new crusade declared by Pope Pius II against the infidels in January 1460. Vlad Dracula joined the effort, which was now led by John Hunyadi's son Matthias Corvinus, allying himself with Corvinus to combat the Ottomans. Mehmed II took the last independent city in Serbia, Smederevo, in a violent assault in 1459. Just a few months later, Vlad's ally, the Hungarian general Mihaly Szilágyi, was captured during a battle near Bazias and was sawn in half after being tortured, a grim fate which many of his men suffered. The Sultan then took several cities in Greece and threatened to return to Wallachia unless tribute, called jizya, was paid to him. Envoys were sent to Vlad's court to collect both the money and men for the Janissary forces. It was at this juncture in 1460 that Vlad Dracula decided to clarify his position towards the possibility of any relationship with the Turks. When the emissaries arrived, he asked them to take off their turbans, part of the traditional wardrobe of an Ottoman, because removing the hat in the presence of a Wallachian prince, especially in his court, was customary and expected. The diplomats refused as it was part of their attire. Vlad informed them he would not give the Sultan anything and would not negotiate, and promptly had the representatives' turbans nailed to their heads. As a form of symbolic rejection of any claims to Turkish overlordship in Wallachia, it was certainly a blunt and effective one. Meanwhile, the Turks began recruiting troops as they crossed the Danube and led assaults against the Transylvanians, to which Vlad promptly responded by impaling any prisoners his men took in the conflict. In November 1461, he wrote to the Sultan explaining that he was unable to pay tribute due to financial issues, but noting that he would be willing to go to Constantinople to negotiate a deal. The Sultan heard of Vlad's renewed alliance with Corvinus at this juncture and attempted to lure Vlad into a trap so that he could capture him to bring him to Constantinople in chains instead. Vlad learned of the plot, and he set his own trap for the Sultan's bey or chieftain of Nicopolis, Hamza Pasha, and his men in a narrow pass north of Giorgio, using gunpowder to easily overpower the Turks. The bey and his men were quickly surrounded and defeated by the Transylvanian army. Vlad the Impaler then had the Turkish troops killed by impaling them. He had Pasha skewered on a stake that would stand taller than his men to signify his rank and place. He had the staked bodies placed in a field, forming a macabre forest. Vlad was evidently perturbing the Sultan in Istanbul at this stage. When he was informed of the ambush, he is said to have struck the messenger who delivered the news, in fury at this latest setback. Vlad now undertook a fierce campaign into Ottoman lands in the spring of 1462. Because of his fluency in Turkish, Vlad was able to infiltrate the Ottoman territories on the other side of the Danube, leading his forces through the Turkish-occupied regions of Bulgaria, in between the Black Sea and Serbia. He would demand the gates to open for him, and once they did, he would lead an army into the fray. Vlad the Impaler executed every soldier and Ottoman sympathizer, traveling over 800 kilometers during the course of 2 weeks. They killed well over 23,000 Turks and allies, impaling them and leaving their bodies on the stakes for others to see. In response, the Sultan sent his men to destroy the port of Braila in Wallachia, but the 18,000-man force he had sent under his vizier Mahmud were defeated by Vlad and his troops, leaving only around 8,000 Ottomans alive. These victories solidified Vlad's place in Europe as a successful warlord, a fearsome defender of Europe's borders against the Ottoman infidels. For a short time at least, he was celebrated by the Pope and was revered by Christians, but was deeply feared by Muslims. The Sultan grew infuriated at the news of Vlad the Impaler's continuing successes and turned to deal with the prince himself. Both rulers now prepared their armies for the upcoming conflict. The Sultan raised an army of between 150,000 and 300,000 men, comprised of his bodyguards, engineers, women for comfort, priests, astrologers, riflemen, pikemen, cannons, slave soldiers, archers, infantry, janissaries, and cavalry. Dracula's brother Radu even served as part of the mustered Turkish forces, commanding around 4,000 cavalrymen. Vlad rallied a significantly smaller force, especially since Corvinus did not aid him, despite Dracula's request for assistance. Men, women and children aged between 12 and 18 were recruited, including Roma slaves and farmers, building an army of around 30,000 poorly trained, armed and armoured Transylvanians. Even though he was vastly outnumbered, Vlad the Impaler and his force was able to kill around 300 Janissaries after the Sultan left Vidin, and he knew the only way to win was to commit unthinkable and vicious acts. Vlad could not hope to win against the Ottomans in the field now. The best he could hope for was to wage a guerrilla campaign in country that he and his forces had greater knowledge of, and in which they would have greater local support. The Prince of Wallachia ordered the evacuation of the neighbouring territories, removing the people and animals from the land as the Sultan's army advanced. He poisoned the rivers and lakes with the bodies of animals and humans, and burned farmland to destroy crops in a scorched earth tactic. This would leave nothing for the advancing Turks but barren fields. Knowing his army would be no match for the Ottomans, Vlad resorted to night raids to harass the Turkish opponents. Vlad also ordered men, women and children who were suffering from contagious diseases such as bubonic plague, leprosy, tuberculosis or cholera to travel to the Ottoman camps or to stay in villages that would be in the path of the invaders. This would potentially infect the area and help contaminate the Turks with the illnesses. Vlad was essentially using germ or biological warfare here to slow down the Ottoman advance and deplete their forces. These efforts were clandestine and incredibly effective in causing problems for the Ottomans in their attempts to take Wallachia. The capital of Wallachia, the city of Târgoviște, home to Vlad Dracula's Poinari castle, was met with the advancing Turkish troops who, previously, had been unable to take either the island of Snagov or the fortress of Bucharest. Vlad ordered his 24,000 men to take refuge in the mountains near the capital as the Ottomans reached the city limits, knowing that he and his men would either die at the hands of the Sultan's army or from starvation should they hunker down in the mountains. Vlad the Impaler implemented his education and past experiences to escape. Vlad disguised himself once more and snuck into the Ottoman army camp, passing by unnoticed thanks to his mastery of the Turkish language, and made his way through the tents. He discovered the Sultan had ordered his men to remain in their tents to keep them from losing their nerve should they fall under attack. He uncovered the location of the Sultan's tent and then slipped back to his camp in the mountains to plan an attack on Mehmed's men and assassinate the Sultan in his tent later. On the evening of the 17th of June 1462, the Prince of Wallachia split his men into two divisions and had them set to attack from either side of the camp, using the Turkish prisoners to help them infiltrate the camp's outskirts. The first wave hit and rolled through the camp. The opposite side did not act. The Wallachians slayed around 15,000 Ottomans, losing only around 5,000 men in the process. Vlad Dracula inadvertently entered the wrong tent. Nevertheless, the incident, which has become known as the night attack on Târgoviște, has gone down in history as one of the most daring elements of Vlad's colourful career, the episode in which he nearly managed to infiltrate the Ottoman camp and slay the conqueror of Constantinople. As dawn rose, Vlad the Impaler and his men retreated to the mountains and escaped without any pursuers. Many of the Ottomans were disheartened and wanted to head back towards the Ottoman lands, but Sultan Mehmed ultimately determined to continue the campaign. Yet just hours later they came upon the macabre field which Vlad had decorated months earlier with the bodies of Hamza Pasha and his 20,000-man army. The Turks were horrified by the scene, which even by the standards of Balkan warfare in this brutal period was particularly shocking. Consequently, the Sultan now ordered his men back, leaving Radu with his Janissaries to oversee affairs near Târgoviște on the 22nd of June. There is a myth that Dracula's first wife, a woman who has never been officially named and whose identity has been left to the legends of Romanian history, saw the arrival of Radu and his men at the base of the castle at Târgoviște, perched up high on the cliffs overlooking Târgoviște and the Argeș River. Despite having one son, Mihnea the Bad, with Vlad the Impaler, further details about her remain unknown. The legend, though, is that at the sight of the Ottomans, Vlad's wife is said to have remarked she would rather feed the fish than be taken by the Turks. She then threw herself to her death in the waters below. Radu now established himself as the new ruler of Wallachia, while the Ottomans moved on to burn the city of Brăila. Vlad Dracula led several attacks throughout Wallachia, while his brother and the remnants of Vlad's forces hurried to the town of Chilia. Here, Stephen III of Moldavia had initiated a siege, hoping to take advantage of the distress his former close ally found himself in as a result of the massive Ottoman invasion of his lands. Vlad and his army successfully repelled Stephen and his forces, injuring Stephen in the process, but despite this limited success, Vlad was forced to flee to Hungary to seek aid from Matthias Corvinus to plan future battles and strategies. In Hungary, by the end of the autumn of 1462, Vlad believed that he had successfully acquired Hungarian support to launch a counterattack against the Ottomans the following spring. That Corvinus had actually planned a trap at Castle King's Rock, capturing Vlad just as he crossed into Wallachia. Why Corvinus betrayed Vlad is not precisely known, although it has been suggested Corvinus hoped to be named Holy Roman Emperor, and it would have been in his interest to end any aggression with the Ottomans so that he could turn his attentions towards Central Europe. Whatever the purpose of it, Corvinus would not be named Holy Roman Emperor, although in 1464 he was dubbed King Matthias of Hungary. Vlad fell victim in late 1462 to his having been a border warlord caught between the Hungarians and the Ottomans. Despite his determined opposition to the Turks over a decade-and-a-half long period, he was still distrusted in Buda, and as a consequence he was imprisoned on suspicion of coordinating with the Sultan, despite how improbable this seems. Between 1462 and 1466, Vlad was first detained in Oratia fortress located in Podu Dâmbovice today, then in Visegrad. Over the course of this period, King Matthias and Vlad's relationship grew more favorable, though he was not released. In the meantime, his brother Radu, the real collaborator with the Sultan, ruled Wallachia as the new voivoda. During the early years of his house arrest, Vlad Dracula converted to Catholicism and married Ilona Szilágyi, cousin to King Matthias. He was given greater freedom in 1466. Vlad and Ilona were also gifted a home in Pest, one of the two towns on either side of the Danube, along with Buda, which would later join to become Budapest. Here they lived with their two sons, Vlad IV, Tepalus, and Mircea. Vlad spent many years here, settling into a seemingly sedentary retirement, but in truth he longed to return to Wallachia and reclaim his position there. To this end, in the mid-1470s, after well over 10 years in Hungary, Vlad Dracula reached out to Stephen V Báthory, a prominent military commander, future voivoda of Transylvania, Hungarian judge royal, and ally of King Matthias, to help him with the task of building an army comprising of Moldavian, Hungarian, Transylvanian, and Wallachian forces. The mission for Stephen and Vlad was simple: take Wallachia from Prince Basarab Laiota cel Bartran, who had claimed the voivodeship from Vlad's brother Radu in late 1474 or early 1475. Radu appears to have died shortly thereafter while trying to reclaim the position himself, though the details of his death are unclear. This left Vlad as the only Dracula, a legitimate son of Vlad II Dracul, left to seek the position of voivoda, and Vlad, who was nearing his 50th year by this time, was determined to reclaim it. He managed to do so with little effort. Vlad and Stephen's forces arrived in the autumn of 1476 and met no resistance. Instead, Basarab's army fled and allowed Dracula to resume his rule over Wallachia. Stephen Báthory returned to Transylvania, leaving Vlad alone to defend his land from any threat. Vlad did not have long to enjoy his reclamation of the rule of Wallachia. Not long after his re-establishment on the Wallachian throne on the 26th of November 1476, Vlad's lands were once again besieged by a large army of Ottoman Turks who campaigned north against him in an effort to reimpose Basarab as a pro-Ottoman voivoda. Vlad found he had only around 2,000 men to fight the Ottomans' force of even in excess of 4,000, who relatively easily crushed his Wallachian army. Vlad also died around this time, though the exact date and details of his death are not clear. Though it was known he had died by the 10th of January 1477, he might have died on the field of battle against the Turks, or may have been betrayed by his Wallachian boyar enemies and murdered, or was injured in a hunting accident which led to his death around the time of the new Ottoman invasion. There are several myths regarding Vlad Dracula's demise that have helped fuel the myth of Dracula throughout the world. A few believe Dracula was not killed during this period, instead being captured and ransomed, then moved to Italy, remaining there until his death and being buried at Santa Maria Nova Church in Naples. This theory has frequently been disputed and contested by other archaeologists, historians and researchers who find the evidence supporting this notion almost entirely lacking and unsubstantiated. The most commonly accepted story about his death says that Vlad the Impaler met his end at the hands of the Ottomans, either being captured by the Turks, beheaded, having his head preserved in honey, and then put on a pike to be brought to Istanbul as evidence of his death, or being impaled in the same manner he had become infamous for. Either way, the lore of his reign was the stuff of legend and became intermixed with the truth of his life. It is not known exactly where Dracula was buried, although there were rumors that he was interred callously by his adversary Basarab the Elder at the Comana Monastery, which Vlad had established and constructed. In 1931, archaeologists found a casket draped with a purple and gold veil at the Snagov Monastery in Bucharest. Aside from a skeleton, the coffin contained pieces of silk brocade, a ring like one worn by members of the Order of the Dragon, and a crown reminiscent of an oil painting of Vlad the Impaler. Was this Vlad himself? The contents of the grave of Snagov were taken to the History Museum of Bucharest to be studied, but all the artifacts and bones promptly vanished, adding further to the mystery and legend of Vlad Dracula and the whereabouts of his corpse. In the aftermath of Vlad's death, the Principality of Wallachia continued to experience years of instability, being governed by short-lived rulers such as Basarab Vlad and Patron, who briefly reclaimed the voivodeship at the time of Vlad's death, but who was then himself quickly overthrown by a new Hungarian-supported voivoda, Basarab IV. Throughout this tumultuous era, the principality was devastated as a result of being caught between the Ottoman Turks on one hand and the Christian powers to the northwest and the Kingdom of Hungary on the other. Thus, for instance, on the 13th of October 1479, the Battle of Bredfield was fought in nearby Transylvania, a major battle between the Hungarians, allied with the Serbs, Wallachians and others, against the Ottomans. This was the largest battle yet fought in the Balkans to prevent the Ottoman advance in the aftermath of the fall of Constantinople, and ended in victory for the Hungarians and their allies. Ultimately, however, the Turkish advance was too strong, as sheer numbers led the sultans to begin imposing themselves more fully over Wallachia, Transylvania, Moldavia and Serbia in the early 16th century. This was compounded by growing divisions within European Christendom, following the inception of the Protestant Reformation in the late 1510s. Thus, in 1526, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent defeated the remaining Balkan powers and the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohacs. Consequently, for the next 2 centuries, the Austrian Habsburgs were the front line of European Christendom's defense, a role it had to perform on many occasions, most notably in 1683 when the Turks threatened to capture Vienna itself, and during which they were only prevented from doing so by the arrival of the Polish army to relieve the Austrians. Given all of this, it is unsurprising to find that Wallachia, despite Vlad's efforts to resist Turkish encroachments, fell firmly under Ottoman control in the 16th century, and remained in that position until the late 18th century, when Turkish domination was swapped for Russian geopolitical dominance in the region. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when Romanian nationalism became a major force in the region in the course of the 19th century, Vlad was reimagined not as a brutal sadistic ruler, but as a Romanian nationalist himself who had tried to resist Turkish subjugation of Wallachia. Today, Vlad Dracula is frequently considered to be a prime example of a human embodiment of evil. His violence and cruelties towards his own people and enemies became synonymous with his name. His most famous portrayal came in the form of Bram Stoker's Dracula, a late 19th century Gothic novel told from the letters of different characters regarding their interactions with a strange man, Count Dracula, who is later revealed to be a vampire. Stoker took his inspiration from Vlad's name, but mainly from the mythology of Romania and the wider Balkans and other aspects of vampiric lore. How does one appraise a character such as Vlad III Dracula, whose life is shrouded in myth, exaggeration, and fantastical tales? Firstly, it must be said that many of the tales about him were doubtlessly embellished, and have been further so over the last 120 or so years, as sensationalist accounts have abounded of the life of the man who inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. What should be said first is that Vlad was almost certainly not as tyrannical and bloodthirsty as many accounts of his life made him out to be. These exaggerated tales about him started early and have continued ever since. Pamphleteers and writers in late 15th and 16th century Europe were just as anxious to concoct elaborate tales about the strange lord who lived on the peripheries of Europe and engaged in excessively cruel behavior. Thus, any assessment of Vlad the Impaler must be undertaken with a hefty dose of skepticism about what has been written about him over the last 550 years. And yet, these reservations aside, there is no doubting that Vlad's reputation must have come from somewhere. He did widely employ the tactic of impaling his enemies on spikes, even though it may be fantastical to suggest over 100,000 people fell victim to this proclivity of his. Equally, he may well have widely employed torture and other terror tactics to try to rule Wallachia. But while it does not excuse his behavior, this must be viewed in context. What must be remembered in interpreting Vlad the Impaler's life was that he was living through a period of increasing brutality and slaughter in southeastern Europe as the religious wars between the Christians of Hungary and the buffer states such as Wallachia intensified against the onslaughts of the Ottoman Turks. Wallachia found itself in the unenviable position of being caught in the middle of the clash between Christian Hungary and the Muslim Ottomans, continuously devastated by both sides as they tried to impose favourable candidates as voivoda. All sides engaged in atrocities and criminal acts of violence. Viewed in this light, Vlad was not really the instigator of extreme violence in 15th century Wallachia, but was actually more a product of the culture of violence. What do you think of Vlad the Impaler? Was he a grim hero and a protector of Romania, caught up in a wider religious war in the Balkans, which Wallachia found itself at the forefront of, or was he a bloodthirsty madman who exemplified the worst parts of humanity? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The woman known to history as Catherine de' Medici was born on the 13th of April 1519 in the city of Florence, in Renaissance Italy. Her mother was Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, Countess of Boulogne, who came from an aristocratic background and was descended from an ancient and influential French family with links to the French ruling elite. Her father was Lorenzo de' Medici, ruler of Florence from 1516 to 1519 and Duke of Urbino. Unlike his wife, Lorenzo did not come from an aristocratic family, but the Medici family had risen to prominence in the 1430s after making a fortune in banking and acquiring power by financing several European royal families. The Medicis promoted the cultural renaissance in Florence and went on to rule the city for over 300 years, from 1434 to 1737. Many Medicis, including Catherine, made impressive marriages, and several Medicis were elected as Pope. Catherine's parents had been married for a year before her birth. Their union had been planned as part of an alliance between King Francis I of France and Lorenzo's uncle, Pope Leo X, against their mutual rival Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. As a result of her father's heritage, Catherine was perceived as a noblewoman, but not as a member of the upper echelons of the Italian aristocracy. However, her family did wield huge power, wealth, and influence, which would be important in securing Catherine an advantageous match when she reached marrying age. Catherine was an only child and was orphaned not long after her birth. Her mother died of either puerperal fever, caused by an infection picked up during childbirth, or the plague, only a few days after Catherine's birth on the 28th of April 1519. Her father died 21 days after his daughter's birth, possibly from syphilis, on the 4th of May 1519 at the Villa Medici at Careggi in Florence. He was buried in the Medici chapel of Florence's Church of San Lorenzo, which was adorned, in true Medici style, with Michelangelo's sculpture Penseroso, which represented the Duke. Lorenzo's tomb has often been confused with that of his illustrious grandfather, Lorenzo the Magnificent, which also had a Michelangelo sculpture. Catherine spent her childhood passing between various prominent relations, including her paternal grandmother Alfonsina Orsini and, after she died in 1520, her aunt Clarice de Medici, where she was raised along with her cousins. She was raised as a Roman Catholic and received an education befitting a noblewoman from nuns in Florence and Rome. In line with the expectation that Catherine would make an advantageous marriage, possibly to a foreign prince, she would have been taught to speak fluently in Italian, French, and Latin at the very least. Grand plans for Catherine's upbringing had been made by more than just her grandmother and aunt. King Francis I of France had wanted Catherine to be raised at the French court, no doubt in order to see her married to a French aristocrat or even one of his own sons. But Pope Leo X blocked this scheme as he planned to have her marry Ippolito de' Medici, Lord of Florence. Pope Leo made Catherine Duchess of Urbino in line with this plan, but then annexed most of the Duchy of Urbino in the name of the Papal States, reducing her status. After the death of Pope Leo X in 1521, Medici power in the Vatican was interrupted until Cardinal Giulio de' Medici was elected as Pope Clement VII in 1523. It was during this period, between the Medici popes, that Catherine's status as Duchess of Urbino became contentious. The title and lands of the Duke of Urbino were given to Francesca Maria I della Rovere by Pope Leo's successor, Adrian VI. The Florentine people continued to refer to Catherine as Duchessina, meaning the Little Duchess, referencing her claim to the Duchy of Urbino. During this time, Catherine stayed in the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, the first Medici palace, the occasional workplace of great artists like Donatello, Michelangelo, and Botticelli, and the modern-day seat of local government in Florence. In 1527, the Medicis were overthrown in Florence by a faction which opposed Pope Clement's representative, Cardinal Silvio Passerini. Catherine was taken hostage and moved from convent to convent. Finally, she found consistency and peace at Santissima Annunziata delle Murate for 3 years, a period which she described as the happiest of her entire life. This momentary interlude in a life defined by political maneuverings must have seemed tranquil. However, the city of Florence was not permanently lost to the Medicis. With an eye on Europe-wide political events, and in order to gain support for the recapture of Florence, Pope Clement crowned the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain Charles V in an elaborate and sacred ceremony in the San Petronio Basilica in Bologna on the 24th of February 1530. The coronation aimed to heal the political and religious divides which had blown up when the mutinous Spanish, German and Italian troops of Charles V had sacked Rome in 1527. The alliance would also be used against the threat posed by the Ottoman Turks, who were seeking dominance in Eastern Europe and had reached Vienna, an important royal city in the Holy Roman Empire, in 1529. Charles V's military support in Florence was well rewarded, as Charles V was the last Holy Roman Emperor to be awarded the honour of being crowned by a pope. The retaking of Florence began in October 1529 and lasted until the city surrendered on the 12th of August 1530. During the siege, there were calls for Catherine's execution, and even for her naked exposure and use by the troops for sexual gratification. But this period of siege and her residence in Santissima Annunziata delle Murate ended for Catherine when Pope Clement called her to Rome in 1530 in order to find her a husband. While in Rome at the bequest of Pope Clement, Catherine had many suitors. The most illustrious of her suitors was King James V of Scotland, who sent the Duke of Albany to arrange the marriage on 2 separate occasions, once in April 1530 and again 7 months later in November. Although Catherine did not marry the eager Scottish king, their stories would later become entwined when Catherine helped to raise his daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. A second influential suitor was Henry, Duke of Orleans, second son of King Francis I of France and the future King Henry II. Henry belonged to the Valois dynasty, which had ruled France since the 14th century. By early 1533, Henry was openly courting her, and he was to be a fortuitous match for the wealthy but common-born Catherine. Catherine de' Medici and Henry, Duke of Orleans, were married at Église Saint-Ferréol-les-Augustins in Marseille on the 28th of October 1533, when Catherine was 14. The wedding was an extravagant affair with a grand display of gift-giving and festivities which went on late into the night. The couple and their distinguished guests celebrated with dancing and feasting, and Henry jousted, his favourite pastime, for his new wife's hand. After leaving the ball, the couple consummated their marriage apparently under the watch of King Francis I, who was determined to see the union properly joined. That morning the couple were visited and blessed in their marital bed by Pope Clement. In the first year of marriage, Catherine saw little of her husband, who openly took mistresses. It was said that Henry was gloomy and introverted because he had spent 4 years as a captive in Spain during the formative years of his youth, that Catherine's intelligence, wit, and keenness to please made favourable impressions on the ladies of the French court. However, this favourable start to her life in France was quickly reversed. The death of her uncle, Pope Clement, on the 25th of September 1534, undermined Catherine's position and influence at court. The situation worsened when Pope Clement's successor, Alessandro Farnese, broke off the alliance with France and ceased to pay Catherine's large dowry. King Francis I apparently lamented Catherine's reversal of fortune and the marriage which had once seemed so fortunate, by announcing, "The girl has come to me stark naked." As well as her tenuous position as a now dowryless foreigner, Catherine was also under huge pressure to provide the Valois dynasty with the heir and spare which would ensure the dynasty's survival. The stakes were even higher in France, as under Salic law, an ancient Frankish civil law code, only males could ascend the throne. Catherine greatly desired a son, a blessing which would cement her position in France, but in the first 10 years of their marriage, the couple had no children at all. The pressure to conceive built when Henry's older brother, the Dauphin of France, Francis, died of a fever in 1536. Rumours began to spread that either Catherine or the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had poisoned the Dauphin. Catherine became the sole target of blame for the lack of a legitimate heir when Henry publicly acknowledged his affair with Philippa Ducie and the birth of his daughter Diane in 1537. It was at this time that divorce was discussed, and many clamoured for Catherine to be sent back to Italy. In a period when witch hunting was reaching its peak, rumours that Catherine practised witchcraft began to circulate, feeding into the image of her as the Black Queen, which has persisted to today. As a woman's role was viewed in terms of her ability to create and sustain life, infertile women were seen as unnatural and as witches with the opposite power, that of destroying health, life, and fertility. Catherine's connection with the astrologer and seer Nostradamus, and even more suspicious Ruggieri brothers, who it was believed engaged in necromancy and the black arts, did little to help Catherine's reputation. After trying every natural and superstitious remedy for inducing pregnancy, including drinking mule's urine, Catherine finally gave birth to her first child and son, Francis, on the 19th of January 1544. She went on to have a daughter, Elizabeth, on the 2nd of April 1545, and a further 8 children, 7 of whom survived infancy. She succeeded in providing the dynasty with 5 boys who could inherit the throne: the future Francis II, Louis, the future Charles IX, the future Henry III, and Francis, Duke of Anjou. The future of the Valois dynasty was now secure, but Catherine's pregnancies did nothing to improve her marriage. Her husband was devoted to his favourite mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who was 19 years his senior. Catherine's influence was rooted solely in her motherhood, as her husband ignored her, and she would later become very skilled at presenting herself as the devoted mother of future kings and of France itself. The death of King Francis I on the 31st of March 1547 made Catherine Queen Consort of France. She was crowned in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the resting place of many French kings, and a former medieval abbey church in northern Paris, on the 10th of June 1549. But she was to enjoy no political influence as Queen Consort, besides wielding the nominal power of regent during her husband's travels abroad. The days of Catherine's power and influence were all still ahead of her. Instead of utilizing the wisdom and skill of his wife, Henry promoted the influence of his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, giving her the chateau of Chenonceau. It was even reported by the imperial ambassador that Henry would sit on Diane's lap, discuss politics with her, and stroke her breasts when in company. Diane did not see Catherine as a threat, having already essentially usurped her position and privileges as the wife of the king. Diane actually encouraged Henry to spend time with Catherine and to sire more legitimate children with her. In 1556, Catherine almost died in childbirth. The royal surgeons only saved her life in a terrible exchange for the life of one of her twin girls, Joan, who died in the womb, while Victoria survived, but only for 7 more weeks. As the king's physician advised Henry against having any more children with Catherine, he stopped visiting her and instead spent all of his time with his long-term mistress Diane. Catherine would have no more children. Along with her own children, Catherine played a role in raising Mary, Queen of Scots, daughter of her once suitor James V of Scotland. Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, was the sister of Henry's boyhood friend Francis, Duke of Guise, and had married King James V of Scotland in 1538. Mary of Guise ruled Scotland as regent for her daughter Mary, who had taken the throne when she was less than 1 week old. Mary, Queen of Scots, lived at the French court from the age of 5 and was promised in marriage to Catherine's eldest son, the Dauphin Francis. Francis and Mary were married on the 24th of April 1558, when Francis was 15 years old and Mary was 17 years old. They would be married for only 2 years due to the premature death of Francis. In 1559, Catherine's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, became the second among her children to marry. The marriage, like Catherine's own, was part of a political alliance. After the death of Catherine's father, Lorenzo de' Medici, in 1492, the balance of power and economic growth of Catherine's home country, Italy, collapsed. This combination of wealth and political instability drew in Italy's enemies, and for over 50 years, from 1494 to 1559, the Italian peninsula became a battleground between the French Valois dynasty, the Habsburgs, the Ottoman Turks, and the English. These long Italian wars, sometimes called the Habsburg-Valois Wars, were brought to an end on the 3rd to the 4th of April 1559, when Henry II signed the Peace of Cateau Cambresis with Philip II of Spain and Elizabeth I of England. The treaty was sealed with the marriage of the 13-year-old Elizabeth to King Philip II of Spain, a fellow Catholic. The union was celebrated in Paris on the 22nd of June 1559 with 5 days of jousting, festivities, balls and masks, a form of courtly entertainment from Italy in which participants dance and exchange gifts with their host while in disguise. Despite the lavishness of the entertainments, the marriage was only a proxy wedding, as the couple themselves were not present. Henry took part in the celebratory jousting, boldly wearing his mistress Diane's black and white colours. He was victorious against his friend the Duke of Guise and the Duke of Nemours, but was knocked off his saddle by Gabriel de Lorge, the Earl of Montgomery, in an honourable joust. Insisting on riding out again against Montgomery, Henry's face was shattered by Montgomery's lance. Reeling from the clash, with blood pouring down his face and large splinters buried deep in his eye and head, Henry was carried away. Catherine, Diane, and Francis the Dauphin are said to have all fainted at the terrible sight. After the splinters were removed from his eye and brain at the Château de Tonnelle, the king lay in a shifting state. Catherine stayed with him, but Diane stayed away for fear of being expelled by the Queen. Over the next 10 days, Henry sat up to dictate letters and listen to music, but began to lose his sight, speech, and reason, finally dying on the 10th of July, 1559, at the age of 40. From this day, Catherine adopted the broken lance as her emblem, inscribed with the words Lacrimae hinc hinc dolor, meaning, "From this come my tears, my pain," and wore mourning black for the rest of her life in memory of her husband. Catherine recognized that image cultivation was an important part of successful kingship and worked to promote an image of herself as a faithful widow and devoted mother. In 1559, at 40 years old, Catherine took her first steps into the political spotlight after her husband's death. She insisted on being called Queen Mother rather than Dowager, which solidified the image of herself she wanted to project, that of a loving and devoted mother, and the title amplified her closeness to the next monarch, her son Francis. Francis II, Catherine's oldest son, became King of France at the age of 15. His coronation was held in Rheims on the 21st of September 1559. It was said that the crown was so heavy that Francis couldn't hold it up alone and required trusted nobles to help hold it in place on his head. It was rumoured that Francis was frail and of ill health. He had married Mary, Queen of Scots, the year before, and, in what has been called a coup d'etat, Francis, the Duke of Guise, and his brother, Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, seized power, moving themselves into the Louvre Palace with the young couple. The House of Guise were staunch supporters of the Roman Catholic cause, but after failing to aid the Catholics in Scotland, the old alliance between Catholic France and Scotland was dissolved, causing the Guises to focus their Catholic campaign on France. Out of necessity, Catherine worked with the Guises because she was not guaranteed a role in Francis's government, as he was deemed old enough to rule alone. In France, the royal age of majority was 14. Yet she was to wield greater power as the mother of the king than she had done as the wife of the king. King Francis II's official acts began with, "This being the good pleasure of the Queen, my lady mother, and I also approving of every opinion that she holdeth, am content and command that." Catherine exploited her newfound authority. She forced Diane de Poitiers to hand over the crown jewels and vacate the Château de Chenonceau before proceeding to undo all of Diane's building work there. All those at the court and in government who had been patronized by Diane were quickly replaced, including Jean Bertrand, keeper of the seals of France, who was succeeded by Chancellor François Olivier, who had been dismissed by Diane a few years previously. As the Guise brothers and the new French government set to policy-making, the issue of the religious conflict was becoming desperate. Religious divisions had grown across the whole of Europe as the Protestant Reformation, ignited by Martin Luther's criticism of the Roman Catholic Church, unleashed a complex political and religious storm which engulfed the whole of Europe and France in particular. The Valois royal family were Catholic, but France had a growing Protestant population, and its neighbours, including Great Britain, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and parts of Germany, were turning to Protestantism. The Huguenots were a group of French Protestants who followed the Reformed or Calvinist Protestant faith. They made up almost 10% of the French population and practiced their religion publicly. The Huguenots were vocal in their criticism of the Catholic Church, denouncing the Pope as a tyrant holding false sway over God's creation. Religious violence was played out on the streets of France. Lynchings and murders had religious motivations. Churches were sacked, sacred texts were destroyed, and the bodies of saints were dug up and burned. Clearly, the government had to do something, but the policies of the Guise brothers did not at all fit with Catherine's preferred course of action. The Guise brothers began persecuting Protestants, but Catherine adopted a more moderate stance and spoke out against the persecutions. Although she had been raised as a Roman Catholic and had been related to several popes, the depth of her religious conviction was questioned as she prioritized peace over religious principles. Whether her conciliatory policy was rooted in her lack of religious conviction, her belief in freedom of worship, desire for peace at any cost, or, more likely, her political acumen, Catherine succeeded in crafting a place for herself in the political sphere in opposition to the Guises. The hardline stance taken up by the Guise brothers fueled the conflict. The Huguenots looked to Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, and then to his brother Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, for support to topple the Guises. With the rise of religious violence, the royal court was moved to the fortified Château of Amboise in the Loire Valley in central France. The Duke of Guise then launched a surprise attack on the Huguenots in the woods nearby and killed many, including the Huguenots' commander La Renaudie. As Catherine and her court watched, many of the rebels were slain, drowned in the river, or were strung up around the battlements. Catherine found an ally for her strategies for defending the law in the face of the growing anarchy when Chancellor Michel de l'Hôpital was appointed in June 1560. Neither Catherine nor the new Chancellor agreed with the practice pursued by the Guise brothers of punishing Protestants who were peaceful and worshipped privately. Catherine and Chancellor de l'Hôpital put their policy of conciliation to an assembly of the Privy Council at Fontainebleau on the 20th of August 1560. Historians have seen this stroke of effective diplomacy as an early example of Catherine's talent for statesmanship as she set her policy for peace in opposition to the Guise brothers. Meanwhile, the Prince of Condé's army began attacking towns in the south of France in the autumn of 1560. Catherine ordered the Prince of Condé to the royal court, and when he arrived, had him imprisoned, tried for offences against the crown, and sentenced to death. His life was saved by the timely death of the king, the result of an ear infection or abscess in his brain. Showing her astuteness, Catherine recognized that her son's death was imminent and made a pact with Antoine de Bourbon, a Huguenot leader, to the benefit of her second son, Charles. Antoine de Bourbon agreed to renounce his right to the regency of the future king, Charles IX, in return for the release of his brother. So, when Francis II died on the 5th of December 1560, Catherine was appointed governor of France by the Privy Council. For the first time, she was to have sweeping powers. After her rise into the government, Catherine wrote a letter to her daughter Elizabeth expressing her views about power. "My principal aim is to have the honour of God before my eyes in all things and to preserve my authority, not for myself, but for the conservation of this kingdom and for the good of all your brothers." The coronation of Charles IX saw Catherine's influence solidified. The 9-year-old Charles IX is said to have cried through his coronation. Catherine kept him close during the start of his reign, reportedly sleeping in his chamber and certainly presiding over his council, policy-making, state business and patronage. Charles was not just vulnerable due to his youth. Like his older brother, he was not a healthy child. The Venetian ambassador reported that Charles was an admirable child, though he is not robust. He favours physical exercises that is too violent for his health, for he suffers from shortness of breath. The frailty of the boy on the throne was compounded by the volatile situation in France at the time. Catherine seized the reins of power for her frail son, but she never controlled the whole country as France was engulfed in a civil war. Large swathes of the country were ruled by noblemen and religious divides impeded political power. Catherine summoned the church leaders from both sides of the religious divide to solve their doctrinal differences. Leaders of the Catholic and Protestant churches in France met, on Catherine's instructions, to find a compromise between their religious convictions. Despite Catherine's optimism, the Colloquy of Poissy, as this meeting was called, failed, and on the 13th of October 1561, the meeting dissolved itself without her permission. Politics had blinded Catherine to reality. She had failed to understand the religious divides which were impeding the functioning of political power. She believed that getting the religious leaders to agree would resolve everything, and completely underestimated the strength of religious convictions. In an attempt to make a success of her conciliation policy, Catherine issued the Edict of Saint-Germain in January 1562. The edict aimed to promote tolerance between the religious groups and pacify the Protestants. However, the massacre of Vassy on the 1st of March 1562 undid all her efforts. The Duke of Guise and his men attacked worshipping Huguenots in a barn at Vassy, killing 74 and wounding 104. Guise was treated as a hero by the Parisian population. The Huguenots called for revenge. For the next 30 years, France flitted between states of outright civil war and an uneasy truce. Within a month of the infamous massacre of Vassy, Huguenots Louis de Bourbon and Admiral Gaspard de Coligny had raised an army of 1,800 and formed a useful alliance with England. The Duke of Guise's hard-line policy towards the Huguenots fueled Huguenot victories, who began seizing town after town. Catherine met with Admiral Coligny to find a compromise, but the talks reached a stalemate, and Catherine resorted to meeting violence with violence. The royal army struck swiftly, laying siege to Huguenot-held Rouen. Catherine visited the field herself against the warnings of her advisors and attended the deathbed of Huguenot leader Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, when he was fatally wounded. But the Catholic triumph was short-lived, as on the 18th of February 1563, a spy, Poltrot de Méré, killed the Duke of Guise with an arquebus, the first gun fired from the shoulder and resembling a rifle at the siege of Orléans, triggering a blood feud amongst the aristocratic families on either side of the religious divide. Catherine was delighted at Guise's death, as his hand was removed from her son's government. She reportedly told the Venetian ambassador that if Monsieur de Guise had perished sooner, peace would have been achieved more quickly. Finally, the war was brought to an end on the 19th of March 1563 with the signing of the Edict of Amboise, also known as the Edict of Pacification. But France's problems were not over, as the English retained a power base on the French coast, so Catherine rallied both Huguenot and Catholic forces to retake Le Havre from the English. These successes did not change the fundamental fact that Catherine's power was not her own. On the 17th of August 1563, it was declared at the Parliament of Rouen that Charles IX had now reached majority age and could rule alone. But Charles continued to show little interest in the technicalities of ruling, and Catherine continued to steer him. Intent on reviving loyalty to the crown after a tumultuous period, Catherine took a long tour of France with Charles from January 1564 to May 1565. She aimed to bolster the Edict of Amboise, the hard-won peace, and promote unity, and to this end she held talks with Jeanne d'Albret, the Protestant Queen Regent of Navarre, wife of the late Antoine de Bourbon, and mother of King Henry III of Navarre. But her attempts at unity were not received with praise from everyone. When visiting her daughter Elizabeth, her son-in-law, the devoutly Catholic Philip of Spain, refused to see her and instead sent the Duke of Alba to tell her to tackle heresy more brutally, advice which Catherine ignored. Catherine's conciliatory policies were failing to bring the religious conflict to an end. On the 27th of September 1567, the Huguenots attempted to ambush the king, an event known as the Surprise of Meaux, and the civil war continued. The French court fled to Paris to escape the encroaching violence. Bloodshed and civil unrest continued well after another peace settlement was agreed, the Peace of Longjumeau on the 22nd to 23rd of March 1568. The Surprise of Meaux marked a turning point in Catherine's policy towards the Huguenots. She finally abandoned her policy of compromise for one of repression once the Huguenots had targeted the king. In June 1568, she told the Venetian ambassador that the Huguenots were traitors and praised the Duke of Alba's reign of terror in the Netherlands, where Calvinists and rebels were executed in their thousands. The royalist army forced the Huguenots to retreat to the fortified stronghold of La Rochelle on the west coast, where Jeanne d'Albret and her 15-year-old son Henry of Navarre joined them. Around this time, Jeanne wrote to Catherine expressing her desire to die rather than abandon her God and religion. Catherine, who had always underestimated the religious conviction of the Huguenots, decried Jeanne as the most shameless woman in the world. Catherine saw Jeanne's decision to rebel as a deliberate dynastic threat rather than a move fueled by religious conviction. But despite Catherine's anger, fighting on was no longer an option. On the 8th of August 1570, the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye was signed because the royal army had run out of money. Despite Catherine's decision to pursue a more hard-line policy, this latest peace actually conceded wider toleration to the Huguenots than ever before. Whether this was the result of the throne's weak negotiating position or part of Catherine's old and preferred conciliatory policy is unclear. With a temporary peace in place, Catherine sought to bolster Valois interests and power by setting up several grand dynastic marriages. In 1570, King Charles IX married Elizabeth of Austria, daughter of Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor, in a proxy wedding in Speyer in modern-day Germany. Catherine also sought a match between one of her sons and England's Elizabeth I, but this idea never took off. She worked to replenish the family's connection with Philip II of Spain after his wife and her oldest daughter, Elizabeth, died in childbirth in 1568. She planned to marry her youngest daughter, Margaret, to Philip, and also sought a union between Margaret and Henry of Navarre, the son of Jean d'Albret, to combine Valois and Bourbon interests. However, Margaret was secretly involved with Henry of Guise, son of the late Duke of Guise, which resulted in a beating from her mother, Catherine, and her brother, the king, when they found out. Catherine succeeded in luring Jeanne to court and convinced her to agree to a marriage between Margaret and Jean's son, Henry, with the caveat that Henry be permitted to remain a Huguenot. The wedding that took place on the 18th of August 1572 at Notre Dame, Paris, was overshadowed somewhat by the recent death of Jeanne, who was taken ill upon her arrival in Paris. It was said that Catherine had murdered her with poisoned gloves. The rumour that Catherine had killed Jean d'Albret was not the most damaging rumour about her circulating that summer in 1572. Catherine's reputation was to be stained by the events of the St Bartholomew's Day massacre, which began only days after her daughter Margaret's wedding. On the 21st of August 1572, 3 days after the royal wedding which had brought influential Huguenots to Paris, Admiral Coligny, the Huguenot leader, was shot while walking home from the Louvre. A smoking arquebus was discovered in a window, but the culprit escaped. Coligny was treated by surgeon Ambroise Paré, who removed the bullet from his elbow and amputated a damaged finger with a pair of scissors. Catherine made a tearful visit to Coligny, despite apparently receiving the news of this attack without any display of emotion, and promised revenge on his attacker. Several historians have blamed Catherine for the attack on Coligny. Others have pointed to the Guise family or to a Spanish papal plot to end Coligny's influence on the king. Whatever the truth, the bloodbath that followed grew quickly out of control. 2 days later, on the 23rd of August 1572, the St Bartholomew's Day massacre broke out. Roman Catholic mobs murdered Protestant Huguenots en masse. Innocents were targeted, including children, the elderly, and pregnant women. Bodies were thrown into the River Seine, and corpses were hung in the streets. Paintings of the carnage on the streets of Paris show unimaginable horrors, and often, such as the painting by Protestant painter François Dubois, the black-clad figure of Catherine looking coldly upon the violence. It was said that Catherine was party to Charles IX's decision to kill them all, as he aimed to strike first against an expected Huguenot revenge attack for the shooting of Coligny. The slaughter lasted for a week and spread outwards from Paris across much of France, where it lasted into the autumn, becoming a season of slaughter, as historian Jules Michelet put it. In total, approximately 3,000 Protestants were killed in Paris and a further 70,000 across the whole of France. After the bloodshed finally abated in Paris, Catherine's reputation was in tatters, but she was not downcast. Her son-in-law, Henry of Navarre, knelt at an altar as a Roman Catholic on the 29th of September, having converted to avoid death, and, as the ambassadors reported, Catherine had laughed triumphantly at the sight. The legend of the wicked Italian, the Black Queen, spread from this moment. She was accused of being a disciple of Machiavelli, of using the tactics of his treatise, The Prince, to remove all of her enemies in one deadly blow. It was a well-targeted criticism, given that Machiavelli had dedicated The Prince to to Catherine's father, Lorenzo. The Huguenots responded to the massacre with propaganda, a tactic made doubly effective by their mastery of the relatively new art of printing with a printing press. Within weeks, propaganda papers were produced and distributed en masse, and Catherine was their natural target. In 1575, a particularly influential manuscript by an anonymous author titled Discours merveilleux de la vie, action et déportement de Catherine de Medici blamed Catherine for the massacre and denounced her as the epitome of female evil. The manuscript became a bestseller and triggered an avalanche of propaganda and accusations against Catherine. Her reputation as a devoted queen mother was permanently blackened, and old prejudices against her as a duplicitous Florentine and power-hungry Medici resurfaced. The black clothes she wore as an ongoing sign of her loyalty to her late husband were turned into the costume of an angel of death. The document had achieved its aim of preventing Catherine from consolidating her power after the death of her second son, Charles IX. Some even called for her to be put on trial for the murder of the Huguenots. The debate over the level of responsibility Catherine held for the horrific events of St Bartholomew's Day is still ongoing. Some historians have argued that Catherine perhaps ordered the assassination of several Protestant leaders while they were together in Paris for the wedding, but that the scale and unpredictability of the actions of the mob could not have been ordered or controlled by anyone. Yet Catherine had almost always opted for a conciliatory path. She wanted unity and peace for the sake of political stability and the longevity of the Valois dynasty. She had organized the wedding between her own daughter and Henry of Navarre and had invited prominent Huguenots to the celebrations in Paris. It seems unlikely that she would then set out to ruin this opportunity for unity, which she herself had created by calling forth a violent mob to massacre the Huguenots. And she continued to act in line with her policy of conciliation well after the massacre and its aftermath. But the Protestants, and anyone who had become tired of Catherine's moderate policies, remained convinced that she was to blame for the massacre. As with the painting by Protestant painter François Dubois and the Discours merveilleux manuscript, the criticism of Catherine would play out loudly on the public stage and in the realm of the arts, and Catherine would not take it lying down. Catherine believed, as many Renaissance princes and scholars did, that power depended as much on cultural display as on force. She had inherited the Medici family's taste for fine art and became a patroness of the arts, bolstering French culture as much as her family had in Florence. In an age of declining loyalty to the monarchy, she used the arts to increase the prestige of the Valois dynasty, launching an artistic patronage program which lasted for 3 decades. She tapped into the rising popularity of portraiture by inviting resident portrait artists to the French court and commissioning thousands of portraits of her family. Although she spent enormous sums of money on the arts, there was little permanent legacy of her work. The festivals and entertainments she arranged and the school of artists she patronized did not live on after she was gone. Only her love for architecture left a lasting mark, including several restored royal palaces, 2 new palaces she had built in Paris, the Tuileries and the Hôtel de la Reine, as well as the Italian Renaissance-style tomb in which she and her husband would lay. 2 years after the events of the St Bartholomew's Day massacre, another dynastic crisis threatened to unseat Catherine and the Valois line. King Charles IX died at the age of 23 of tuberculosis, apparently calling out Catherine's name with his last dying breath. Leaving no heir, Charles was succeeded by his brother Henry, Duke of Anjou. Henry was recalled from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where he had been elected king the year before. Abandoning this throne for the crown of France, Henry came to the throne as an experienced and grown man, unlike his two older brothers, although Catherine was grieved by Charles's death, writing to Henry that she was grief-stricken to have witnessed such a scene and the love which he showed me at the end. It was said that Henry was her favourite son. She added in her letter to him that her only consolation is to see you here soon, as your kingdom requires, and in good health, for if I were to lose you, I would have myself buried alive with you. Despite the advantages of experience, maturity, and health, Henry proved to be as equally fitful as his brothers when it came to displaying interest in the tasks of government. Henry's disinterest in ruling was perhaps rooted in his religious devotion. He showed much more interest in displays of piety, pilgrimage, and flagellation than in the politics of ruling. Just as Francis and Charles had, Henry relied heavily on Catherine when it came to the practicalities of ruling. So, even though Catherine did not have the formal powers of a regent, as she had when Charles had ruled as a minor, she continued to hold huge power and influence over the government. Henry's coronation was held at Rheims Cathedral on the 13th of February 1575, and 2 days later he married Louise de Lorraine-Vaudemont, his choice thwarting Catherine's plans for a political marriage to a foreign princess. This marriage was a childless one, which had deep consequences for Catherine's family. Henry III's heir was his younger brother, Francis, Duke of Alençon. But instead of fulfilling his duties as Dauphin, Francis exploited the anarchy of the civil wars to his own advantage. Despite Catherine summoning him for a 6-hour telling off about his subversive behaviour in March 1578, Francis would not be stopped, and the Valois dynasty looked set to crumble. Francis allied with the Protestant princes against the crown and his brother Henry III, and besieged Paris in the spring of 1576. The resulting peace of Monsieur, Francis's nickname, and Edict of Beaulieu was granted by Catherine on the 6th of May 1576 and represented a huge concession to Huguenot demands. Protestants were now permitted to worship in public, build their own churches, and were guaranteed representation in the strongly Catholic Parliament, a guarantee which would later be rescinded by the States General of Blois and cause the return of Henry of Navarre to his Calvinist religion and to leading armed rebellion. There was also to be compensation for the families of the victims of the St Bartholomew's Day massacre. It was said that Francis forced Catherine and Henry to pass the act. Many Catholics were extremely opposed to these concessions, and particularly to the recognition given to Protestant political organizations, and formed their own political organization called the Catholic League in protest. As well as deepening religious grievances, the peace treaty also failed to bring an end to Francis's dangerous behavior. Francis's army launched a disastrous intervention in the Low Countries in the middle of 1584, but in June of that year, Francis died of consumption. Despite their differences, Catherine then wrote, "I am so wretched to live long enough to see so many people die before me, although I realize that God's will must be obeyed, that He owns everything, and that He lends us only for as long as He likes the children whom He gives us." The death of her youngest son was a dynastic calamity. She had no more living sons to inherit the throne, and any surviving daughters were not eligible to rule due to their gender. The Huguenot King Henry III of Navarre now became heir presumptive to the French crown. Although Catherine had wisely married her youngest daughter Margaret to Henry of Navarre, she could rely on her daughter Margaret little more than she could rely on her troublesome son Francis, Duke of Alençon. Margaret had returned to the French court without her husband in 1582, and Catherine was overheard berating her daughter for taking lovers. After being sent back to her husband, Margaret fled again in 1585, retreated to her property at Agen, and begged her mother for money. Catherine sent only enough money for food in an attempt to force Margaret to return home. But Margaret moved on to the fortress of Calas and took another lover, a nobleman called D'Aubiac. Catherine demanded that Henry of Navarre act to resolve his marital difficulties before shame was brought upon them all, and in October 1586 he locked Margaret up in the Château d'Usseau. D'Aubiac was executed, though not, as Catherine had wished, in front of Margaret. Catherine cut Margaret out of her will and never saw her again. Catherine's control over the crown had reduced since the reign of her elder two sons, but she still functioned as Henry's chief executive of government and as a travelling diplomat. She travelled widely across the kingdom, enforcing his authority and trying to head off war. In 1578, at the age of 59, she embarked on an 18-month journey around the south of France to meet Huguenot leaders. Her efforts won Catherine new respect from the French people, and on her return to Paris in 1579, she was greeted outside the city by the parliament and large crowds. The Venetian ambassador, Girolamo Lippomano, wrote of Catherine, "She is an indefatigable princess, born to tame and govern a people as unruly as the French. They now recognize her merits, her concern for unity, and are sorry not to have appreciated her sooner." Catherine herself, however, was under no illusions about the desperate situation facing the Valois dynasty, and on the 25th of November 1579, she wrote to the king, "You are on the eve of a general revolt. Anyone who tells you differently is a liar." As Catherine had predicted, many leading Roman Catholics were appalled by her attempts to appease the Huguenots, and in particular by the Edict of Beaulieu, which had furthered Protestant rights. Local Catholic leagues were formed with the aim of protecting the Catholic religion and Catholic privileges from rising Protestantism. After the death of Francis the Dauphin in 1584, the Duke of Guise assumed the leadership of the Catholic League in order to block the succession of Huguenot Henry of Navarre and put Henry's Catholic uncle, Cardinal Charles de Bourbon, on the throne instead. Guise recruited powerful Catholic princes, nobles and bishops, formed a union with Spain under the Treaty of Joinville, and readied for war against the heretics. By 1585, King Henry III had to face the reality of war against the Catholic League, who were stirring up the civil war once more. Catherine apparently counseled Henry on the delicate nature of the situation, but also warned him that peace is carried on a stick. She wrote to her favourite son to "Take care, especially about your person. There is so much treachery about that I die of fear." Trapped in a difficult situation, Henry was unable to fight both the Catholics and the Protestants at the same time, both of whom had larger and better resourced armies than his own. Henry decided to initially seek peace with the Catholics, and on the 7th of July 1585 signed the Treaty of Nemours, agreeing to meet all of the League's demands, even paying its troops. Then, driven by his religious convictions, Henry retreated into hiding to fast and pray, taking with him his personal bodyguard, a loyal force known as the 45, and leaving Catherine to find a resolution to what was quickly becoming a constitutional crisis. The Valois monarchy had lost control of the country. To make matters worse, a Europe-wide Catholic backlash against the Protestants was on the rise in 1587. The instability in France forced Henry III and Catherine to refuse assistance to England after the execution of Mary Queen of Scots on the 8th of February 1587 caused fury amongst the Catholic world, and the Spanish prepared to launch its armada against England. Recognizing the vulnerability of royal power in France, the Spanish ambassador apparently told King Philip II of Spain that the abscess was about to burst. the Catholic League honoured their treaty with the Spanish and seized control of much of northern France to allow the Spanish Armada access to French ports. With his rule completely undermined by the Catholic League and widespread religious divisions, Henry then made several mistakes. Seeing that Paris was vulnerable, Henry hired Swiss troops to help him defend the city and himself. But the Parisians took it upon themselves to defend the city and built barricades in the streets on the 12th of May 1588. They refused to take orders from Henry and announced that they would take orders only from the Duke of Guise. Catherine reportedly forced her way through the barricades to Mass, the people acquiescing to her passing, and then, as chronicler L'Estoile reported, cried all through lunch. She later wrote to statesman and future Chancellor Pompon de Bellièvre, "Never have I seen myself in such trouble or with so little light by which to escape." Acting upon his mother's sage advice, Henry fled Paris just in time and signed the Act of Union on the 15th of June 1588, giving in to the League's latest demands to give himself the chance to fight again another day. Then Henry made his second mistake. On the 8th of September 1588, Henry dismissed all of his ministers without warning as the French court gathered for a meeting of the estates. Atypically, he had not conferred with Catherine about this decision, and she was kept in the dark about the events while she suffered from a lung infection. Henry's mistake, and the even greater one which followed, effectively ended Catherine's days of power and the Valois dynasty. At the meeting of the estates, Henry thanked Catherine for everything she had done, calling her Mother of the King and Mother of the State. Then, on the 23rd of December 1588, Henry invited the Duke of Guise to visit him at the Château de Blois. Again, without conferring with Catherine, Henry acted to resolve all of the problems facing him and made his third great mistake. As Guise entered the king's chamber for the proposed meeting, the 45, Henry's bodyguard, stabbed Guise to death, symbolically at the foot of the king's bed. Simultaneously, Henry's men captured 8 members of the Guise family, including the Duke of Guise's brother and the Cardinal of Guise, Louis II, who was later hacked to death in the palace dungeons. Once the murders were complete, Henry finally shared his decisions with Catherine, begged her for forgiveness, and excused his brash and violent scheme as an attempt to prevent Guise doing the same to him. Although Catherine's initial reaction to these events cannot be known, her son's actions had certainly not reflected her own cautious and shrewd diplomacy. On Christmas Day, she prayed with a friar and lamented, "O wretched man, what has he done? Pray for him. I see him rushing towards his ruin." When she visited her old friend Cardinal de Bourbon on the 1st of January 1589, her promise that he would be freed soon was met with the cardinal's derision as he responded, "Your words, madame, have led us all to this butchery." Catherine died only a few days later on the 5th of January 1589 at the age of 69. It is likely that she died from pleurisy, an inflammation on the lungs, the condition which had kept her bedbound in December and which had perhaps encouraged her son to move against the Duke of Guise without conferring with her first. It was generally believed that Catherine's life had been shortened by the stress and by her anger at her son's rash actions. As Paris was still held by enemies of the crown, Catherine could not be buried there with her husband. Instead, she was initially buried at the Saint-Sauveur de Blois church in Blois, near the Château Royal de Blois, where she had died. Her body was later moved to the Basilica Cathedral of Saint-Denis in northern Paris, the traditional resting place for French monarchs of the period, and placed next to her husband, Henry II. This reinterment was arranged by Henry II's illegitimate daughter with Philippa Ducci, Diane de France, Duchess of Angoulême. The tomb of Henry and Catherine, an elaborate temple-like structure with 4 statues representing the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude and temperance, was desecrated during the French Revolution in October 1793, like those of many other kings and queens of France. However, the tomb was saved by archaeologist Alexandre Lenoir and preserved at the Museum of French Monuments. During the Second Bourbon Restoration between 1815 and 1830, the tomb was returned to the Basilica of Saint-Denis. Catherine was not outlived by her son for very long, as Henry III was stabbed to death by Jacques Clément 8 months after Catherine's initial burial. When he was killed, Henry had been besieging Paris with Henry of Navarre, who went on to succeed him as King Henry IV of France. The death of Catherine's last son represented the end of almost 3 centuries of Valois rule and brought the House of Bourbon to power. Catherine had outlived all of her children except Henry, who died only months later, and Margaret, who she had disowned. King Henry IV later said of Catherine, his mother-in-law and enemy, "What could a woman do, left by the death of her husband with 5 little children on her arms, and 2 families of France who were thinking of grasping the crown, our own and the Guises? Was she not compelled to play strange parts to deceive first one and then the other, in order to guard, as she did, her sons, who successively reigned through the wise conduct of that shrewd woman? I am surprised that she never did worse." Catherine had risen to become the most powerful woman in 16th century Europe. Born into the prominent Medici family, then the rulers of Florence and famous patrons of the arts, she rose to become the Queen of France by marriage to King Henry II and wielded immense power as the Queen Mother of 3 French kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, the last French king of the Valois dynasty. But her legacy has been mired by attitudes towards powerful women and foreigners, and by the controversies which coincided with her time as the power behind the French crown. The complexity of the civil and religious wars which her 3 sons ruled through make assessing her difficult. Catherine's influence over her sons, their governments, and their policy-making made her an easy target for blame. The blame she carried, whether justly or not, for the persecutions carried out under her son's rule, and especially the St Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were killed, tainted her memory. Catherine has been remembered as the Black Queen, as a follower of Machiavelli's cutthroat political theories, rather than as a Queen Mother who pursued policies of conciliation, patronized the arts, and, above all, worked to save the Valois dynasty. Although Catherine's ruthlessness is not a fabrication of historians, as it comes through clearly in her letters and in the words of those who knew her, there is much more to her story. Like many female rulers before and after her, she has been flattened out by history, made into a 2-dimensional character, as her moniker, the Black Queen, shows, while the complexities of her character and the situation are ignored. Her authority was hugely limited by the effects of the civil wars, and in the context of the political and religious turmoil, her policies appear to simply be desperate measures to keep the Valois monarchy on the throne, from her policy of conciliation with the Huguenots and marriage of her own daughter to the Huguenot leader, Henry of Navarre, to her patronage of the arts in an attempt to glorify the monarchy. Without Catherine, it seems unlikely that her sons would have held on to the throne in their lifetimes. What do you think of Catherine de' Medici? Was she the Black Queen that history has remembered her as? Or was she the devoted mother and politically astute woman which she hoped to be remembered as? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, Thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as King Edward III was born on the 13th of November 1312 at Windsor Castle in the English county of Berkshire. His father was Edward II, King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Duke of Aquitaine in France, who had succeeded his father, the imposing Edward I, otherwise known as Edward Longshanks, in 1307, when he was just 23 years of age. While Edward II had produced a son around the time of his accession, this child, Adam Fitzroy, was illegitimate, and as a result the birth of the future Edward III in 1312 was greeted with great joy, as he secured the royal succession. Edward III's mother was Queen Isabella, the daughter of the King of France, Philip IV. Born in 1295, she grew up at the various French royal palaces around Paris, before being married to Edward II in January 1308, when she herself was just 12 years of age and only a few months into what would become Edward's highly tumultuous reign. The England into which the future Edward III was born in 1312 was experiencing great instability. Edward I had created one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe in his lengthy reign between 1272 and 1307. He completed the English conquest of Wales, intervened in Scotland, and extended English rule across the Irish Sea in Ireland. He also reformed the judiciary and administration to complete a process whereby England became the most centralized state in Europe of the High Middle Ages. However, the formation of this highly centralized and expanded English state under Edward Longshanks presented a major problem following his death in 1307. His son, Edward II, was a weak ruler, one who placed enormous power in the hands of a series of favored individuals throughout his 20-year reign, a practice which created great resentment amongst the English lords and political community. The first of these favourites, Piers Gaveston, had established a close relationship with Edward in around 1300 when they were both still teenagers. It is still widely debated whether or not the relationship was sexual in nature, but upon Edward's accession in 1307, Gaveston was granted immense powers. He was eventually made first Earl of Cornwall and granted many offices. However, his behaviour highly offended the nobility, and the king was forced to temporarily exile him to Ireland, where he served as the royal viceroy, and ultimately, having returned to England from one such exile, he was, in the summer of 1312, killed by two senior English nobles, the Earl of Lancaster and the Earl of Warwick. This happened just months before the future Edward III's birth at Windsor Castle, but the years ahead did not see any improvement in the circumstances of Edward II's rule. In the course of the 1310s, the king began displaying a similar partiality to that which he previously showed to Gaveston towards Hugh Despenser, the son and namesake of the Earl of Winchester. As the Despenser family rose in power in the years ahead, the English nobility's opposition to Edward II's rule increased ever further. Additionally, Edward I's gains in Scotland were overthrown in 1314, when the English were heavily defeated by a Scottish army led by Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn. As if all this were not bad enough, a famine gripped England in the mid-1310s. Thus, the England the future Edward III was living in during his infancy was experiencing great unrest, in large part owing to the poor governance of his father. Surprisingly little is known about his upbringing, but young Edward would have been totally oblivious to the state of the country at the time he was a young man. Somewhat curiously, he was never made Prince of Wales, as nearly all direct heirs to the throne of England since the late 13th century have been. Instead, he bore the honorific title throughout his youth of Earl of Chester. A separate household, independent from that of the king and queen, was established for Edward, and it was this which he was raised in. Edward was also joined by several siblings in his youth. His brother John was born in August 1316, followed by two sisters, Eleanor and Joan, in 1318 and 1321. Edward may have been partially educated by Richard Berry, a distinguished scholar of 14th century England, but in any event, his education and upbringing would have centred more on the outward physical world rather than the mental world of books. He learned to read and write English and French, but he was only ever possessed of a rudimentary ability to write Latin. He may also have learned some Flemish and German, but if the evidence of Edward's later life is anything to go by, his primary concerns in his youth would have been horsemanship and skill in arms. This, after all, was the high Middle Ages, when a king's ability to lead his people in war was of more consequence than his knowledge of the minutiae of government administration. As he neared his 10th year, the political situation in England reached breaking point. In 1321, a civil war broke out in England, triggered in large part by the king's ongoing support and lavish favour bestowed on the Despencer family and their allies. This revolt was led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, a first cousin of the king's, and one of those who had brought down Piers Gaveston in 1312. Although the king successfully snuffed out this rebellion the following year in 1322 and Lancaster was executed that March, the tensions did not end there. Hugh Despencer was now ascendant within England, but he increasingly had a new enemy in the Queen herself. Isabella had always resented her husband's favourites, but she had not clashed with Gaveston, but with Despencer. In the 1320s it was different. The Queen could not see eye to eye with her husband's favourite, and as the months went by, this increasingly drove her against her husband, and soon a showdown would occur. Ultimately, it was events in France which brought the political instability which had characterized Edward II's entire reign to a conclusion. The kings of England had held possessions in France since the time of the Norman conquest of England in 1066. England's conqueror at that time was William, Duke of Normandy, ruler of a large stretch of northern France. The 2 centuries that followed saw this continental empire increase to include further regions in the southwest of the country, including the Duchy of Aquitaine, and then decline, such that Normandy and other lands were lost. By the early 14th century, the kings of England held only the Duchy of Aquitaine in France. This was a personal possession of the English Plantagenet monarchs rather than a constituent part of the English kingdom. Moreover, because the duchy was a constituent part of the French kingdom, Edward II theoretically owed fealty to the King of France, and until his death in 1314, this was Isabella's father, Philip IV. But thereafter, a series of brief reigns followed, finally stabilizing in January 1322 with the accession of Charles IV, Isabella's brother. It was this familial tie between the new French king and the English queen which provided the first stirrings of Edward II's downfall in the mid-1320s. Shortly after Charles's accession in France, in 1323, a dispute arose in Aquitaine, which saw an official of the French king hanged by the seneschal of the duchy, Edward II's senior representative there. In response, Charles IV invaded the duchy, an action which now led to Hugh Despencer to have Isabella arrested in England as a French alien in the country. Back in France, Charles IV responded to news of his sister's imprisonment in her adopted home by sending an emissary to Edward II in England, recommending that Isabella should be sent to France as his ambassador to undertake peace negotiations. It was an unorthodox arrangement, but one which the English king consented to. Isabella left for France in March 1325. This was the beginning of the end for Edward II. In France, Isabella came into the orbit of Roger Mortimer, an exiled English lord around whom a faction of Englishmen opposed to Edward II and the Despensers had coalesced in France. The Queen and Mortimer would soon enter into a relationship. More significantly, in September 1325, the young Edward, Earl of Chester, the future King Edward III, was dispatched to France. Why Edward sent his 12-year-old son to continental Europe is still something of a mystery. The most likely explanation is that he was unwilling to travel to France himself and appear before Charles IV as part of the peace negotiations, during the course of which he would have been required to pay homage to Charles, a fellow king, but one who Edward was technically a subject of as Duke of Aquitaine. Accordingly, Edward seems to have hit on the idea of transferring the Duchy of Aquitaine to his 12-year-old son, as a way of avoiding acknowledging his subordinate position to the French king. Whatever the reasons, it was a dreadful strategic error. With the young Edward in France, the anti-Despenser faction of English nobles at the Gallic court in Paris, led by Isabella and Roger Mortimer, now had a viable contender to the English throne to present as a figurehead for a revolt. The error was soon realized in England, where the Despensers and the king sent a command to send the young Edward back home, but Isabella refused this. Thus, by the end of 1325, many of the necessary conditions were in place for Isabella and Mortimer to attempt to overthrow Edward II's regime and the Despensers in England, but Isabella's brother was reluctant to help. For all that Charles IV had been willing to help Isabella during her predicament in England, he drew the line at sponsoring an invasion of England. Accordingly, in the summer of 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and their supporters, with the young Prince Edward in tow, headed for Hainaut, a small principality near what today is the border between France and Belgium. There, Isabella came to an agreement with the Count of the territory, William I, that in return for military aid she would marry Prince Edward to William's daughter Philippa. He agreed and provided Isabella and Mortimer with several hundred men. This small force was ultimately enough. In late September 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and about 700 men landed in Suffolk. In the weeks that followed, support for Edward II simply evaporated throughout England. Years of resentments at his reckless rule and the undue favour he had shown the Despensers suddenly burst forth. Most critically, the City of London declared for Isabella and Prince Edward. In mid-November, the king was apprehended in South Wales and placed under arrest at Kenilworth Castle, while the senior members of the Despenser family were captured and quickly put to death. Thereafter, the end of Edward II's reign was concluded with a relative degree of peaceful action. On the 13th of January 1327, Parliament resolved that Edward II had to be deposed in favour of his son and namesake. The resolution was put to the king at Kenilworth, and in tears he agreed to abdicate on the 20th of January. Prince Edward was accordingly proclaimed as Edward III, King of England, Lord of Ireland and Duke of Aquitaine, in London on the 25th of January. A week later, he was formally crowned at Westminster Abbey. All of these actions were undertaken in the name of young Prince Edward, who had just turned 14 in November 1326. There is no doubting that Edward was little more than a pawn at this stage, and that power in England now rested in the hands of his mother Isabella, her lover Roger Mortimer, and their followers. It had been agreed by Parliament in January that the young king would rule in conjunction with a council consisting of 4 bishops, 4 earls, and 6 barons of the realm. But this arrangement was quickly sidelined by Isabella and Mortimer. The pair would effectively rule England for the 3.5 years that followed. A number of problems confronted the realm during these early days of Edward III's reign. The most pressing was the status of the former king, Edward's father. In the late spring of 1327, he was moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. However, a more lasting solution needed to be found. Isabella and Mortimer's regime was quickly creating unrest, particularly owing to dissatisfaction at the power Mortimer now exercised, and this unrest was coalescing in some circles around the idea of freeing the former king and reinstating him on the throne. A final resolution to the matter was reached on the 21st of September 1327, when the man who had ruled England for 2 decades as Edward II was discreetly murdered on Isabella and Mortimer's orders at Berkeley Castle. An arguably even greater problem confronted the new regime to the north. Seeing the instability which the overthrow of Edward II had created as an opportunity, the Scots, led by Robert the Bruce, had begun a series of raids into northern England and the Crown's possessions in Ireland. Thus, in the summer of 1327, the young King Edward III undertook his first military campaign into the north. This has become known as the Weardale Campaign, after the River Wear, where so much of it occurred and played out in July and August 1327. During the course of it, James, Lord Douglas, in association with the Earls of Mar and Moray, led a contingent of perhaps as many as 10,000 Scots south into northern England. Meanwhile, Isabella and Mortimer, as the newly ascendant power in England, saw the possibility of a successful campaign against the old enemy of Scotland as a good means of legitimizing their new hold on power in young Edward's name. Thus, in mid-July 1327, they headed north from York with their own forces to engage Douglas and the Scots. 2 weeks of jostling now occurred between the two sides as they manoeuvred around northern England, trying to track each other's location and gain a tactical advantage before a standoff occurred near the River Wear for 3 days. Finally, on the night of the 3rd of August and into the early hours of the 4th, the Scottish attacked the English camp, penetrating to the very centre of the English royal encampment. In this moment, young Edward came exceptionally close to being captured by Douglas's troops, but although the ropes of the tent itself were cut, the young monarch remained unharmed and uncaptured. This was the peak of the Weardale campaign. The Scottish attack was pushed back at its most dangerous, and although several further days of toing and froing ensued, ultimately the Weardale campaign was inconclusive, and early in 1328 the regime was forced to stabilise the northern border by agreeing to the Treaty of Northampton, whereby Edward renounced the English crown's claim to the throne of Scotland and acknowledged Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland. However, the campaign and the nearness of his capture had sparked in Edward a desire to master the art of war. Never again would he find himself so defenceless in the face of an enemy on the field of battle. To compound matters, with the relative failure of the Weardale campaign, a diplomatic incident which would have consequences which could not have been foreseen at the time erupted in February 1328. On the first day of that month, the French king, Charles IV, Isabella's brother, died. He had only daughters as his issue, and since it had been decided that a woman would not succeed him, this brought the direct line of the Capetian kings of France to an end, having ruled the country since the late 10th century. There were just 2 candidates to succeed Charles IV. Firstly, Edward III of England, who had the best claim as a grandson of Philip IV, Isabella's father, the long-ruling King of France from 1285 to 1314, and secondly, Philip of Valois. However, Edward's claim was never given real consideration in France, where the thought of a foreign monarch ruling France jointly with England was not considered tolerable by the French nobility. Consequently, the claim of Philip of Valois, a direct descendant of Philip III of France, who had ruled between 1270 and 1285, was favoured. He was formally proclaimed as King of France on the 1st of April, 1328, and crowned at Rheims Cathedral as Philip VI on the 29th of May. It is important to remember, when assessing the events which followed, that Edward did have the better claim to the French throne through his mother. Moreover, as a king himself already, he regarded Philip as a social inferior, one who was merely a count. This sense of his own divine right to rule and superior claim would instill in Edward a great desire to emerge victorious from the coming conflict. In the interim between Philip's accession and his coronation at the end of May, a deputation arrived in Paris sent by Isabella and Mortimer to protest at Edward's exclusion from the succession. However, despite their remonstrations, the French would have none of it. Eventually, after months of objections, Edward, by now 16 years of age, travelled to France in the spring of 1329 and paid homage at Amiens Cathedral to Philip VI as his subject as Duke of Aquitaine. On the surface, this was an end to the matter, but the dispute over the succession would prove much, much more extensive than the apparent show of acceptance in 1329 suggested. While these storms were brewing with both Scotland and France, Edward was growing and developing his own independence. In November 1327, he had been married by proxy to Philippa of Hainaut, in line with the agreement Isabella had reached with Count William of Hainaut in return for his support in overthrowing Edward II in 1326. However, while Edward had been willing to follow his mother's lead on this and many other matters in 1327 and 1328, by 1329 he was becoming his own man and was less willing to allow the realm to be governed by his mother and Mortimer. That year, allies of the young king sent secret communiques to the papacy in Avignon, where a rival papacy to that in Rome had been established. These messages alerted the Avignon papacy that the king was not able to rule in his own right. Matters came to a head in 1330. Enemies of Mortimer's had begun to spread rumours by now that Edward II was still alive, and a plot was discovered to launch a rising in the old king's name, led by his half-brother, the Earl of Kent. However, what really spurred the young king to action were rumours that Isabella was pregnant with Mortimer's child. Concerns were now raised by Edward's advisers, notably a close confidant, William Montague, that a plan might be undertaken by Isabella and Mortimer to usurp the throne from Edward. In this scenario, Mortimer, who was still married to his wife of nearly 30 years, Joan, would divorce her, then marry Isabella, and the pair would place their own child on the throne. After a confrontation at Nottingham Castle in mid-October 1330, Edward elected to act. On the night of the 19th of October, the young king, still a few weeks shy of his 18th birthday, along with Montague and a dozen or so other companions, burst into Isabella and Mortimer's apartments at Nottingham. A scuffle ensued, in which a number of their attendants were killed before the king had his mother and her lover arrested. A parliament was summoned in the days that followed, and an announcement made to the political nation that henceforth Edward would rule in person. Mortimer was dispatched to London, where he was accused and convicted without trial of various high crimes and misdemeanours. On the 29th of November 1330, he was the first individual to ever be executed at Tyburn, the site of a great many political executions in England in the centuries that followed. Edward spared his mother, but her political career was over. In the aftermath of Mortimer's execution, she was packed off to Windsor Castle, where she is rumoured to have suffered a partial nervous breakdown. She remained there under house arrest until 1332, before being allowed to retire to Castle Rising in Norfolk. Here she led an expensive but largely sedentary life for a quarter of a century. Her family retained contact with her, and occasionally there were even talks of her travelling to France, but Edward evidently balked at allowing this to a mother who had favoured Mortimer over her own son in the first years of his reign. She became increasingly pious later in life, and became a nun of the Order of St Clare shortly before her death on the 22nd of August, 1358. With his mother and Mortimer now out of the way, Edward III was free from late 1330 onwards to begin ruling in his own right, just as he turned 18 years of age. The years ahead would see many triumphs, while England had endured a quarter of a century of nearly constant turmoil owing to Edward II's weak rule and then the usurpation of the throne by Mortimer. Edward's reign would see England's power restored and expanded. Under his leadership, the country would ascend to a height unparalleled at any other time in the medieval period. This expansion of English power began in Scotland in the aftermath of the Treaty of Northampton, agreed early in 1328 between King Robert of Scotland and Mortimer and Isabella on Edward's behalf. Robert had agreed to accept the territorial claims of several English border lords to lands in southern Scotland, notably Henry Percy and Henry Beaumont. However, little was done to actually convey ownership of the lands in question to these lords of northern England by Robert, nor was that state of affairs remedied by the minority government which ruled Scotland from 1329 onwards, following Robert's death and the accession of his young son, David II. As a consequence, these lords began to agitate to acquire these lands in the early 1330s. Known as the disinherited, they now began conspiring to overthrow the Bruce line in Scotland by supporting once again the Balliol claim to the Scottish monarchy, the family which had been championed by Edward's grandfather, Edward Longshanks, over 30 years earlier. Thus, Edward Balliol, the rival claimant to the Scottish throne, was brought over from France by the disinherited lords, led by Henry Beaumont. Simultaneously, they petitioned Edward III for permission to undertake an invasion of Scotland, which was refused, although perhaps with enough implicit support for their actions that the disinherited now elected to launch their own military action independent of the king. In the summer of 1332, these lords launched a naval expedition from Yorkshire, which landed at Kinghorn in Fife in eastern Scotland. Proceeding inland, they won a crushing victory over the Scots at the Battle of Duplin Moor on the 11th of August 1332. The figures are very imprecise, but perhaps as many as 5,000 Scots were killed, with very minimal losses for the forces of the disinherited and the Balliols. That year, Edward Balliol was crowned as King of Scotland, thus setting in motion the Second Scottish War of Independence, which would last for a quarter of a century. Edward had not directly supported the disinherited and Balliol in their invasion of Scotland, but a decision now needed to be made on his stance towards the usurper. At a parliament in England which convened at Westminster in September 1332, it was quickly suggested to Edward that the Treaty of Northampton, agreed in 1328, should be scrapped and Balliol's claim to the throne of Scotland acknowledged. In order to gain Edward's support, Balliol even let it be known that he was willing to concede that Scotland would be a fief or vassal state of the English crown, and would pay homage to Edward III. These offers aside, Edward was reluctant to commit himself to a potentially lengthy war in Scotland, but his hands were forced early in 1333 when Balliol was pushed into northern England, having suffered a military reverse at the Battle of Annan in December 1332. This set of circumstances now required Edward to throw his full support behind Balliol. The English Parliament and the government, including the officers of the Exchequer and the courts, were moved to York, where they would remain for the next several years as the young king sought to reimpose English control over Scotland, which his grandfather had been able to establish many years earlier, but which had evaporated under Edward II's ineffectual rule. It is an indication of the single-mindedness and clarity of purpose with which Edward III pursued his goals throughout his reign that he simply relocated the organs of English government to the north of the country, once he committed himself to the war in Scotland. The first action to be taken was to try to seize the border town of Berwick, which was a part of Scotland at the time. A siege was initiated by Balliol, with Edward's support in March of 1333. The king arrived himself to campaign on the border in the early summer, by which time the garrison and townspeople had made it clear to the government of David II to the north that they would surrender if they were not provided with military support by mid-July. The response to this ultimatum from the townspeople of Berwick would lead to the first of Edward III's many great military victories. The guardian of Scotland during David II's minority, Sir Archibald Douglas, now assembled a significant army of upwards of 20,000 men and advanced southwards to engage Edward's forces. They clashed on the 19th of July 1333 at Halidon Hill, some 2 kilometres to the northwest of Berwick. Edward III started the Battle of Halidon Hill heavily outnumbered. The English army consisted of less than 10,000 men, while Douglas led approximately twice this amount to Berwick. However, what Edward lost in numbers was partially made up for in strategic positioning. The king had occupied Halidon Hill specifically because it dominated the surrounding region, and he had resisted all temptations to move, even when Douglas raided further south into northern England in the days leading up to the battle. The English were also possessed of superior military abilities, which would benefit Edward not just at Halidon, but many other times in the years to come. Paramount here was the use of the 6-foot-long longbow, which could deploy volleys of iron-tipped arrows that penetrated chain-mail armour in rapid succession. This was a much more effective projectile than the slow, cumbersome crossbows that were the mainstay of most European armies in the early 14th century. The widespread use of the longbow was just one component of the military revolution which Edward III was responsible for in the mid-14th century. The battle at Halidon Hill commenced at about midday. Although numerically superior, the Scots were required to advance up Halidon Hill, where Edward's armies occupied the high ground. It would have been advisable for Douglas to have never tried to engage Edward while he maintained the high ground. But with the ultimatum given by Berwick to the Scottish government about to expire the next day, Douglas had little option but to try to relieve the town before it surrendered to the English besiegers. The result was an utter rout. The English longbow was used to devastating effect to decimate the Scottish armies as they attempted to advance up the hillside. Eventually, the Scottish forces broke, and the English, led by Edward, advanced downwards themselves, chasing the fleeing Scots towards the sea. By the end of the day, thousands of Scottish troops were dead, perhaps as many as half of Douglas's army of 20,000, while Douglas himself and 5 Scottish earls lost their lives during the battle. Halidon Hill was an immense triumph for Edward, one of the most substantial victories ever won by an English force against the Scots, it also began developing Edward's reputation throughout Europe as a very formidable military commander. Moreover, English arms were now in the ascendant, where previously English armies had been regarded on the continent as distinctly inferior to their counterparts in France and elsewhere. Politically, the victory placed Edward in an extremely advantageous position in Scotland. Berwick quickly surrendered, and a number of Scottish magnates paid homage to the English king in the days and weeks that followed. More pressingly, Balliol was restored to the Scottish throne, and in February 1334 he agreed to surrender 8 counties, constituting the entirety of southern Scotland below the Firth of Forth and the Solway Firth. Then, in June 1334, Balliol paid homage to Edward as his liege lord at Newcastle. David II and his followers fled to France, completing a whirlwind campaign in which Scotland had been almost entirely brought under English control in 18 months. Thus, by mid-1334, the northern frontier seemed to have been secured in a way which it had not been since the days of Edward Longshanks, but where Edward III succeeded, his erstwhile ally Edward Balliol seemed to constantly be found wanting. No sooner had Edward reinstated him in Scotland than Balliol managed to provoke another revolt in the summer of 1334. He was quickly forced to flee Scotland again, once again leading Edward to intervene on his behalf late in 1334 and into 1335. In 1336 he would even campaign into the Highlands, but his encroachments continued to generate resistance. By 1337, Scotland remained somewhat unsecured, and the war would drag on for many years to come. Yet there is little doubting the overall success of Edward's policies towards Scotland in the 1330s. He put England on a surer footing in the north than it had been for 30 years, and secured territorial concessions along the border. Most significantly, he captured Berwick, which would remain an English stronghold on the Scottish border henceforth, except for a brief period in the 15th century. Moreover, Edward might well have gone on to establish an even greater control over Scotland, had it not been for other affairs in 1337. The distraction would come from France, and the fallout would have consequences for both England and France, which would reverberate for over 100 years. The causes of what has come to be known as the 100 Years' War lay in the earlier death of Charles IV in 1328 and the end of the Capetian dynasty in France. As we have seen, Charles's death led to the accession of Philip of the House of Valois as Philip VI of France in the spring of 1328. In reality, Edward had a better claim to the throne of France, but the French nobility had quickly elected to support Philip's accession, being unwilling to have an English foreigner rule them. Isabella and Mortimer had reluctantly accepted this state of affairs and sent Edward to France in 1329 to pay homage to Philip in his role as Duke of Aquitaine. However, the matter did not end there and would be resurrected in the years ahead once tensions created an opportune moment for the issue of the succession to be revisited. In many ways, it was the war in Scotland which created the opportunity for Edward to renew his claims in France. France and Scotland were perennial allies throughout the late medieval period, this old alliance being formed out of their mutual antagonism with England at various times. It is unsurprising, then, to find that David II and his advisers had fled to France following Edward's victory at Halidon Hill in 1333. Over the next few years, as Edward attempted to fully conquer Scotland, Philip VI of France offered substantial support for David's cause. This peaked in 1336, when an enormous French invasion of Scotland was mooted, but Edward was able to stave off the possibility of this by devastating the coastal regions of Scotland, burning crops, and rounding up livestock. No French army could land there if it would not be able to find food to sustain itself in the weeks that followed, and so the invasion was called off. Other controversies led to a further deterioration in relations between France and England in the mid-1330s, notably the refuge that Edward provided to Philip VI's cousin and mortal enemy, Robert, Count of Artois, in England, but in the end it was the simplest route towards the eruption of conflict which caused the 100 Years' War. Edward's most vulnerable territory lay in France itself. On the 24th of May 1337, Philip VI formally announced that he was confiscating the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward. Late that summer, the Count of Eu was sent into the Gascony region with an invasion force, which devastated the countryside but did not seize the duchy's main town of Bordeaux from the English there. This invasion constituted the first military action of a war that would last for over 100 years. Once the war was entered into in 1337, Edward and England were immediately faced with a tactical problem. Aquitaine was located in the southwest of France and was relatively difficult to supply from England. As a result, Edward's strategy from the very inception of the war was to strike back at the French by attacking Philip VI's possessions directly across the English Channel in northern France, and to use territorial gains here as a means of pressuring the French monarch into ceasing his attacks on Aquitaine. Yet there were problems with his methods too. As he had done in Scotland recently, Edward would try to attempt to burn and pillage the countryside of France as a means of forcing the French to the negotiating table and gaining a strategic advantage. But his approach may have been more counterproductive than anything else. This type of scorched earth policy could often have the direct opposite result, instead instilling a hatred of Edward and his armies amongst the common people of the regions they were brutalizing. As such, it did not serve to win over these areas, but actually made them more solidly loyal to the French in the long run. Even this strategy, though, had its drawbacks, principally in terms of the logistics of transporting an army to northern France. By the mid-14th century, the English merchant fleet was substantial, but the ships of the time were small, and it would prove highly difficult to transport an army of the size Edward would need to gain military victories in northern France. This was the problem which Edward faced in 1337 upon the outbreak of war with France. The solution which presented itself mirrored a strategy which Edward's grandfather, Edward I, had employed in the 1290s. He looked for support amongst the many princes and rulers of the Low Countries and in Germany. Hence, in the summer of 1337, the young king, still just 24 years of age, dispatched the Bishop of Lincoln, Henry Burghersh, and his close ally, William Montagu, recently ennobled as the Earl of Salisbury, to Europe. Alliances were quickly negotiated in the weeks that followed, with Hainaut, Guelders, and Brabant in the Low Countries, and most significantly with Louis, Duke of Bavaria, the current Holy Roman Emperor. Overall, Burghersh and Montagu were able to acquire commitments from these rulers to provide approximately 7,000 troops to aid Edward in France, as well as shipping and other logistical support to bring the 10,000 men which Edward intended to bring across to France himself, meaning that a force of nearly 20,000 men would be brought into the field in northern France. Yet these alliances came at a cost. Louis and the other princes had been promised substantial financial subventions from England to pay for the mobilization of their armies. These amounted to £124,000 alone by the end of 1337, a very considerable sum for its time, which amounted to several times Edward's annual income. Therefore, Edward was forced to borrow heavily from the merchant banking families of Italy in the opening stages of the war to pay for the alliance he had created. New taxes were also introduced in England, and Parliament was persuaded to vote Edward an extensive subsidy, or one-off payment. This latter development was significant, though some accounts tend to view the manner in which kings such as Edward III and earlier his grandfather Edward I had recourse to Parliament for subsidies and financing as a self-indulgent use of the Parliament. Such recourse was actually crucial to the development of the English parliamentary system. It was always understood in late medieval and early modern times that parliaments were called when the king or queen of the day needed funding from the political nation, and the political nation in return could express its grievances and requests to the monarch. Edward's use of Parliament in this way actually facilitated the gradual development of the Mother Parliament in the 14th century. Eventually, Edward set sail with his armies from England on the 16th of July 1338 and passed Antwerp in the days that followed with nearly 5,000 men. A meeting followed on the 5th of September at Koblenz, on the River Rhine in Germany between Edward and Louis of Bavaria, at which the Holy Roman Emperor appointed the English king as Vicar General of the Empire, a significant title which theoretically put the military resources of the entire empire at Edward's disposal. With this title in place, and his armies largely assembled in the Low Countries, Edward was finally in a position to take the field in northern France in the spring of 1339. However, this first year of active military campaigning brought with it some frustration, as Philip VI refused to engage Edward in direct combat. An engagement at La Capelle in northeastern France in October was the closest they came to meeting on the field of battle, and this proved a largely abortive clash. Perhaps it was owing to his frustrations at this first year of military campaigning that Edward now made the momentous decision to resurrect his claim to the French throne. Up until early 1340, his stated reason for being in France was to defend his possessions in Aquitaine. But this changed in January 1340. The decision may have been due to a new ally of Edward's, Jacob van Artevelde, a native of Ghent, who had become the predominant political figure in the towns of Flanders in what is now modern-day Belgium. Van Artevelde threw Flanders' support behind Edward in 1339 and persuaded the English monarch to resurrect his claims to the French throne, a right which Edward formally expressed on the 26th of January 1340 when he first began using the title and arms of the kings of France. Edward's decision to claim the French throne was perhaps his most famous and enduring act. In a lifetime characterized by innovations and achievements, the monarchs of England would claim the French throne down to 1802. More immediately, it gave England reason to involve itself on the continent in ways which would allow the English state to retain a foothold in France until the middle of the 16th century. Having claimed the French throne at the outset of 1340, the focus of the war shifted that year to the naval campaign in the English Channel. Philip VI had been building up an impressive fleet in the early stages of the war, which, with contingents provided from his ally, the Kingdom of Castile in Spain, amounted to just over 200 ships by the summer of 1340. The English fleet was being quickly added to, and by the time a decisive engagement was fought in 1340, it had been brought to approximately 150 ships. The decisive naval engagement of this period of the Hundred Years' War occurred at Sluys, off the coast of Flanders on Midsummer's Day, the 24th of June, 1340. Here, the numerically smaller English fleet managed to engage the French ships from relatively close quarters. As a result, the English longbow, which had been used so effectively in Edward's armies since Halidon Hill in 1333, was used to devastating effect. By the evening, it is estimated that as many as 18,000 French mariners and soldiers had lost their lives, and all but 23 of over 200 French ships had been destroyed or captured, while all of the French senior naval commanders had lost their lives. Edward demonstrated here that he was not just a military commander on land, but that he was also able to win substantial victories at sea. Indeed, he had been in the thick of the fighting himself and was wounded by an arrow in the thigh. Sluys was a very considerable victory indeed for Edward. It secured English control over the English Channel for years to come and ensured that the south of England was free from any potential naval attacks throughout the mid-14th century. However, a challenge now faced Edward, which could not be defeated in a land or naval battle. The cost of the war had escalated considerably. Accordingly, in November 1340, a few months after the victory at Sluys, Edward returned in a secretive fashion to England to confront the government, which he had placed in charge of affairs in his absence, on the financial issues. Notably, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Stratford, was furious at first, but a reconciliation of sorts was eventually patched up between the pair in 1341, as Edward's attention was yet again drawn to Scotland. While the war had been raging in France in the late 1330s and into the early 1340s, events in Scotland had necessarily fallen down the pecking order of priorities for Edward, but the conflict here had never ended. Indeed, David II, by now entering his late teenage years and developing his own independence as a claimant to the Scottish throne, had returned to the country from France in the summer of 1341. Both Edinburgh and Stirling had quickly been seized for the Bruce cause thereafter. These occurrences now required Edward's attention, and in the autumn of 1341 he once again made Scotland a priority, campaigning on the Anglo-Scottish border throughout the winter of 1341 and 1342. Yet, while Edward might have wished to divert his attentions in a sustained fashion towards Scotland, before long the war in France became the ultimate priority again. In April 1341, John III, the Duke of Brittany, the ruler of the Duchy of Brittany, a substantial fiefdom in the extreme northwest of the country, died without a clear heir. The succession dispute which now arose presented an opportunity for Edward to test whether his claim to the title of the Crown of France had any weight in France. To do so, Edward supported the claim of John de Montfort, a relative of the recently deceased Duke through his niece, while King Philip VI of France was supporting the claim of Charles, Count of Blois, to succeed to the duchy. Thus began what is known as the War of the Breton Succession, a major component part of the wider 100 Years' War, and one which would drag on in its own right for the ensuing quarter of a century. In the immediate sense, the war in Brittany offered Edward a good opportunity to continue to challenge Philip's authority in France, one which he exploited expertly in the years ahead. The War of the Breton Succession continued apace into the mid-1340s, and it was this localized conflict which was the pretext for Edward to begin preparing a major new invasion force in England in 1345. It would be the following year before it finally left for France, but when it did, the campaign of 1346 would produce some of the most significant engagements of the entire 100 Years' War, and some of Edward's most famous military victories. The exact goals and purpose of the 1346 expedition to France were kept largely secret while it was being prepared in England early in the year, and indeed it is still not clear if there was a specific strategy in mind from the beginning, or if the approach was eventually decided upon and developed in response to events in France. Whatever the overall plan had been, we know what actually occurred. Edward's army, consisting of between 12,000 and 15,000 men, landed on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy on the 12th of July 1346. His goal was to undertake an extensive chevauchée, or military raid, across French territory, a strategic approach which Edward became particularly fond of in France, and which formed another central plank of the military revolution which Edward implemented amongst the English armed forces in the mid-14th century. The campaign was enormously successful in the weeks that followed. The first major strategic victory came on the 26th of July, when the town of Caen in Normandy was seized by Edward. A sack of the city lasted 5 days thereafter, before Edward's forces headed west, the route to Paris now lying open. As substantial as the sacking of Caen had been, though, the main military success of Edward's 1346 campaign occurred a month later. As the English king advanced on Paris, Philip VI was furiously gathering his forces to protect the French capital, and, by mid-August, the French monarch had gathered together an army consisting of well in excess of 20,000 men, which heavily outnumbered Edward's forces, which numbered approximately 12,000 men by the late summer. Meanwhile, Edward had skirted Paris and turned north towards Flanders, where he hoped to combine with some of his erstwhile allies from the Low Countries. Thus, when the two monarchs finally clashed on the 26th of August 1346, it was far to the north of Paris, near Calais, just outside the town of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The Battle of Crécy on the 26th of August 1346 would prove to be one of the most consequential engagements of the entire 100 Years' War. When word reached Edward that Philip's army was nearby, he had his own forces occupy the high ground on the right bank of the River May as it flowed past the village of Crécy. The use of the high ground had served Edward well at Halidon Hill, and it would do the same here. The English forces were formed into 3 units, one of dismounted close combat fighters led by Edward himself, and these were flanked on either side by 2 divisions of longbowmen. The French attack came late in the afternoon and would prove disastrous. The favoured French projectile weapon of the crossbow proved completely inferior to the English longbow, and a division of French crossbowmen quickly broke under sustained English longbow fire. Philip then attempted to send his cavalry directly up the hill towards the English centre, but, like the Scottish at Halidon Hill, the French cavalry was completely overpowered by sustained longbow fire from the English as they attempted to surmount the high ground. By the time the cavalry charge reached Edward's arrayed close-quarters infantry division, they were already severely weakened. The resulting clash was an enormously bloody affair, with the French suffering many casualties. By the time the French broke off and left the field in defeat towards dawn on the 27th of August, approximately 4,000 French troops had been killed, while just a few hundred of Edward's troops had been lost. If there were any doubt by 1346 of the superiority of the English longbow against continental methods of warfare, and the use of the crossbow as a projectile, the Battle of Crécy dispelled that doubt. It also solidified Edward's reputation as one of the great military commanders of Europe, having comprehensively defeated the French king, despite being outnumbered by nearly 2-1 at the outset of the engagement on the 26th of August. Significantly, Crécy was also notable for the use by Edward's forces of a small number of cannon, the first recorded instance of the use of artillery in a field battle in Western Europe. The immediate implication of Edward's astounding victory at Crécy was that northern France was now largely unprotected. As a result, Edward turned his forces towards the nearby town of Calais and laid siege to it on the 3rd of September. It would take nearly a full year to capture the northern French port, but eventually, on the 3rd of August 1347, it fell. This must surely stand as one of Edward's greatest accomplishments. Calais would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries, only finally being retrieved by the French in 1558. The victory at Crécy and the inception of the eventually successful siege of Calais were not the only major successes Edward's England was enjoying in the late summer and autumn of 1346. While the king was in France, the conflict had continued on England's northern border with Scotland. In the early autumn, David II now attempted to take advantage of Edward's absence on the continent by invading northern England. It would prove to be a catastrophic error. He was encouraged in this by Philip VI, who called on his Scottish ally to honour their alliance by attacking England. On the 17th of October 1346, David II's forces, numbering approximately 12,000 men, clashed with an English force of just slightly over half the number David brought into the field at Neville's Cross near Durham. The English forces, led by Lord Ralph Neville, comprehensively routed the numerically superior Scots. Perhaps as many as 2,000 of the Scottish army's troops were killed, but most ominously, David II was captured by Neville's forces. Thus, by the autumn of 1347, Edward's fortunes were soaring. In France, he had won a stunning victory over Philip at Crécy in the late summer of 1346, and he followed it up a year later by capturing the town of Calais. In Scotland, the de Bruce contender to the throne had been captured, leaving Edward in an extremely powerful negotiating position both in France and Scotland. To consolidate his position, Edward negotiated a 9-month-long truce in October 1347 and set off for England victorious. It was at this zenith of achievement back in England during the winter of 1347 and 1348 that Edward elected to follow through on an idea he had been harbouring since at least 1344. Enthralled by the idea of King Arthur and his Round Table, Edward had long had designs to set up his own Round Table and knightly order, and in 1344 he had even begun construction work on a headquarters for such a knightly order at Windsor Castle. Now, with his military fortunes prospering in both France and Scotland, he elected to implement a version of this scheme. This was to be a knightly order dedicated to St George. It was named for the sword belt which the knights of the order would carry. Thus was born the Order of the Garter, a chivalric order which remains the most senior order of knighthood in the British honours system down to the present day. The order's emblem is a garter with the motto Honi soit qui mal y pense, which, translated from the Middle French, means "Shame on him who thinks evil of it." The phrase is said to have been uttered by King Edward at court when the Countess of Salisbury's garter slipped from her leg while she was dancing. The king uttered the words as a rebuke to some courtiers who were laughing at the incident, and so his words became emblematic of chivalrous honour. However, the story is most likely spurious, and there is no actual written account of this version of events until the 1460s, over a century after the founding of the order. At the time of its foundation, the Order of the Garter consisted of Edward himself and 25 knights. Many of those who were amongst the founder knights are unsurprising. For instance, Edward's eldest son and namesake, Edward, known as the Black Prince, was one of the first knights, as was Henry, Earl of Lancaster, and several of the most senior nobles of the realm and supporters of Edward's cause, such as Thomas de Beauchamp, 11th Earl of Warwick, Jean de Grailly, Ralph Stafford, 1st Earl of Stafford, William Montague, 2nd Earl of Salisbury, John de Lisle, 2nd Baron Lisle, Bartholomew Burghersh, 2nd Baron Burghersh, John de Beauchamp, 1st Baron Beauchamp, John de Mohun, 2nd Baron Mohun, Thomas Holland, 1st Earl of Kent, and John Grey, 1st Baron Grey. But there were one or two surprising figures among the first Knights of the Garter. In particular, the inclusion of Roger Mortimer, 2nd Earl of March, seems a curious pick. This was the grandson of none other than the attempted usurper of Edward's royal authority in the late 1320s, Roger Mortimer, who was executed at Tyburn in 1330. This Younger Mortimer had been rehabilitated in the early 1340s, in part owing to his friendship with the Black Prince. Rounding out the list of the first members of the Order of the Garter, Sir Hugh Courtenay, Sir Richard Fitzsimon, Sir Miles Stapleton, Sir Thomas Wale, Sir Hugh Wriothesley, Sir Nell Loring, Sir John Chandos, Sir James Audley, Sir Otto Holland, Sir Henry Eame, Sir Sanchez d'Abricourt, and Sir Walter Pavely. Many of these individuals had accompanied Edward in his campaign to France in 1346, and it seems relatively clear that the order was created in 1348 in part as a means of memorializing the great victories Edward had won at Crécy and Calais. In tandem with the establishment of the Order of the Garter, Edward began a vast reconstruction of Windsor Castle. Conscious of the propaganda value of an imposing royal residence, Edward oversaw the most significant expansion of the primary royal residence of the High Middle Ages, eventually expending £50,000 on the new complex, the most expensive building project undertaken by any English monarch during the medieval period. And yet, it was just one of many great residences which Edward could hold claim to. For instance, he had inherited Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, a vast royal residence in Oxfordshire which King Henry I had built and where the Black Prince was born in 1330. Woodstock would later become the site of Blenheim Palace. However, just as Edward's reign was peaking, it was hit by catastrophe, one which Edward could do nothing to prevent. The bubonic plague, or what is more commonly referred to as the Black Death, in its 14th century iteration, arrived in Europe in 1347, having been carried to the continent from the Black Sea region, where it was hosted in the fleas which lived on black rats. These were transported to Western Europe in 1347 on board the ships of some Genoese merchants who had trading concessions in the ports of the Crimea on the northern shores of the Black Sea. Bubonic plague causes a dreadful illness and death. During the first week of infection, the infected individual develops flu-like symptoms, including a fever, headache, and vomiting. Then, the individual's lymph nodes begin swelling to form what were known in the 14th century as buboes, generally on the neck, armpits, and groin, or where one had been bitten by the fleas which carried the plague. These buboes would eventually break open and gangrene would develop in the extremities of the body, such as the fingers, toes, and the tip of the nose. Death, when it occurred, however, would be due to organ failure, as the disease ravaged the body internally. Estimates of both the population of Europe at the time and the mortality rate of the plague are notoriously imprecise, but it is generally understood that between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed as many as 30 million people in Europe, approximately 1/3 of the population of the continent. The plague arrived in England in the late summer of 1348, and the first recorded cases in London occurred in October. Edward was wholly aware of how fatal it could prove, as his 14-year-old daughter Joan had succumbed to the disease in Bordeaux in France right around the time that the disease first appeared in England in the summer of 1348. As a consequence, like many other English monarchs after him, Edward left London and spent much of the months that followed in less densely populated areas where this catastrophic plague was circulating less aggressively. This was effectively a form of medieval quarantine. The Black Death caused enormous difficulties in England, not just in terms of the sheer scale of the mortality and suffering inflicted by it, but also in terms of the social and economic disruption the pandemic unleashed. A parliament which had been planned for 1349 was abandoned, and the courts were adjourned for months. Meanwhile, mass graves were dug to bury the dead, and the country began implementing quarantine and sanitation measures, as best it could for a medieval state. Though such measures seem relatively simple by contemporary standards, recent events of the 21st century have highlighted how critical simply quarantining and removing of the still diseased bodies of the dead are to solving any pandemic, and Edward's government was efficient in doing so after the initial onslaught of 1348. The most pressing issue in the aftermath of the first calamitous wave of the disease was the issue of labour shortages. With the population of the continent drastically reduced, a lack of manpower would bedevil the European economy for decades to come. However, this crisis was offset in England through one of Edward's most subtle but significant achievements. In the summer of 1349, a preliminary ordinance regulating labour was issued by the king, and this was followed up on in 1351 with the Statute of Labourers. Through this, the labour market was regulated by fixing wages at their pre-plague level, ensuring that the English economy could continue to function even with a drastic labour shortage in the 1350s. Although it may lack the fanfare of Edward's military victories, the passage of the Statute of Labourers was a highly significant aspect of the reign of Edward III. It stabilised the English labour market in the period of chaos which ensued from the Black Death, and through it, England was the only country in Europe which was able to implement effective labour controls in the 1350s. There is some debate as to efficacy, though, and historians have also pointed to the fact that the statute did create social tensions and unrest as well amongst workers who felt they were being shortchanged in a labour market which was advantageous to them in the aftermath of the plague. Moreover, enforcement of the Statute of Labourers on the local level in England was largely entrusted into the hands of the Justices of the Peace, judicial officers who enforced the laws on the county level. These officers already existed prior to the emergency created by the Black Death, but the 1350s saw them gain greater authority and significance as local officers of the Crown. Hence, Edward not only oversaw the stabilisation of the labour market in the aftermath of the Black Death through the Statute of Labourers, but the method by which this was done saw the office of the Justice of the Peace begin to emerge in its modern form. The Justices of the Peace would occupy an important position in English local government for centuries to come, and the office was exported to many other countries between the 16th and 19th centuries. Further domestic reforms were implemented by Edward in the 1350s to better respond to the crisis brought on by the Black Death. The most noteworthy was surely a considerable reform of the English coinage, which was initiated in 1351. Gold coins were introduced, and a new silver coin called the groat also entered circulation. Edward was no administrator with a penchant for the minutiae of government reform, such as were being carried out in the early 1350s, but his strength in this respect lay in his ability to pick individuals who were well suited to overseeing his domestic policies and delegating authority to them. Paramount here were officials such as John Thoresby and William Shareshull, who oversaw the implementation of measures such as the recoinage in the middle years of the century. The reform of England's finances was especially necessary to maintain the perennial war effort. The wars with France and Scotland had not gone away, but the continent-wide emergency created by the Black Death ensured that the truce which Edward had negotiated with Philip VI late in 1347 was largely maintained through the late 1340s. The death of the French king, Edward's long-standing rival, on the 22nd of August 1350, encouraged Edward to begin aggressively pursuing his claims in France again, against Jean II, Philip's son. However, a renewed French alliance with the Kingdom of Castile and Spain, and the presence of a Castilian fleet in the English Channel in the early 1350s, limited Edward's ability to carry out any further invasion of France at this time. In the meantime, the succession war continued in Brittany as a proxy for the 100 Years' War. As a result of this latter delay and the fallout across Western Europe from the Black Death, no new major campaign would take place in France until the mid-1350s. When it eventually came in 1355, Edward planned a two-pronged invasion, one directly across the English Channel to northern France, beginning in Normandy, with a subsidiary campaign being undertaken to the southwest in Gascony. The latter campaign through Gascony would feature one of Edward's sons in a prominent fashion for the first time. Edward and Queen Philippa had at least 12 children, born at regular intervals between 1330 and the mid-1350s. 9 of these lived beyond infancy, a high ratio for the late medieval period. Of these 9, 5 were sons and 4 were daughters. Edward's heir was his son and namesake Edward, born in 1330 and known as the Black Prince. He would play a significant role in the war in France from the late 1350s onwards, having previously commanded a detachment at Crécy when he was just 16 years of age, and having also been a founding member of the Order of the Garter 2 years later. Indeed, it was the Black Prince who commanded the campaign in Aquitaine in 1355. Of his other issue, Edward's third oldest surviving son, John of Gaunt, so named after the town of Ghent, where he was born in 1340, just 3 months before the Battle of Sluys, was also destined to play a significant role in the 100 Years' War, as well as in England's domestic politics in the last 15 or so years of Edward III's life. The dual expeditions of 1355 did not arrive in France until late in the year. The king himself led this expedition in person across the Channel to Calais in the very later autumn, but news then arrived in France that the Scots had yet again taken advantage of the English engagements on the continent to invade northern England. Accordingly, Edward quickly made his way back across the English Channel, and in January 1356 he led his last military campaign into Scotland, reasserting English control over the border region. As a result of this about-turn in northern France, the Black Prince's campaign to Aquitaine would prove much the more consequential of the 2 English expeditions to France of the mid-1350s. The heir to the throne travelled with roughly 300 ships and several thousand men for southwest France in mid-September 1355 and was at Bordeaux by October. The military campaign season was nearly over by this time, but Edward Jr. made a short foray inland towards Toulouse before retiring back to Bordeaux for what remained of the winter. While the campaigns of 1355 had proved lackluster, that of 1356 was one of the most significant of the 100 Years' War. The Black Prince set out in July on a great chevauchée, an extended military raid through France, proceeding east through central France with a force of approximately 6,000 men. The Black Prince's forces burned several towns and villages, including Bourges, before doubling back towards Bordeaux in late August. It was during this movement that the French King Jean II elected to engage the English army. Jean might well have believed that the Black Prince was an inferior commander compared with his father, and in any event the French forces numbered over 10,000, holding an extensive numerical advantage over the English. But if John II believed these factors would give him the upper hand, he was sorely mistaken. At the resulting Battle of Poitiers, which took place on the 19th of September 1356, the Black Prince's forces heavily defeated the French yet again, a feigned retreat first throwing the French lines into disarray, and the English longbow once again being used to devastating effect. Perhaps as many as 2,500 French troops were dead by the end of the battle, but most substantial was the capture of Jean II himself. With David II of Scotland still in English custody since the Battle of Neville's Cross 10 years earlier, the kings of France and Scotland were now both Edward III's captives. This placed the English king in a highly advantageous position. He eventually elected to ransom both in return for military, territorial and political concessions. On the 3rd of October 1357, the Treaty of Berwick was reached with the Scots, whereby David II was released after 11 years in captivity. Edward Balliol had relinquished his claim to the Scottish throne in 1356, so Edward III could now have pressed his own claim to Scotland had he wished to, but instead he opted for a more sanguine approach. David II was released in return for a ransom of 100,000 marks, or just under £67,000, but the arrangement ensured Edward's final acceptance of the De Bruce king's suzerainty over Scotland, thus bringing the long Second Scottish War of Independence to a conclusion after a quarter of a century of conflict. The arrangement eventually arrived at in France, in return for Jean II's release, took longer to negotiate. In the interim, the French king was taken to England and held at various locations, including the Tower of London, and a preliminary treaty to release Jean and put an end to the war was worked out in London in 1358. Through this, it was agreed that Edward would be acknowledged in his possession of Calais and granted the neighbouring county of Ponthieu in the north around the modern-day region of Picardy, while the Duchy of Aquitaine would be expanded to incorporate much of western France. A very sizable ransom would also be paid in return for Jean's release. Yet this draft agreement could not be finalized, and as a result, in 1359, Edward began preparing a new military expedition against France and expanded his demands to include former English possessions in Normandy, as well as control over Maine and Anjou, and suzerainty over the Duchy of Brittany. In return, Edward promised to renounce all of his claims on the throne of France, but the territorial concessions the English king was now seeking would have involved England taking direct possession of almost half of France and virtually the entirety of the north and west of the country. The French could not seriously consider acquiescing to this latest negotiating position, even with their king in English custody. As a consequence, active military campaigning recommenced in the autumn of 1359, when an army of over 10,000 men, commanded by Edward himself, departed across the Channel for Calais. A long and destructive march through eastern and central France followed in the ensuing months, with Edward threatening, though not taking, both Reims and Paris, although he was unable to win a strategic victory which would have improved his bargaining power at renewed peace negotiations. By the late 1350s, the French were wary of meeting Edward and his English forces head-on, having suffered multiple defeats against English armies which they heavily outnumbered over the past 15 or so years. In the midst of this stalemate, negotiations recommenced in the early summer of 1360. The resulting peace, or Treaty of Bretigny, so named after the town near Chartres where it was negotiated, was eventually ratified by Edward on the 24th of October 1360. Under its terms, Jean II was to be released in return for an enormous ransom of £500,000. Edward was to renounce his claims on the French throne, and in return he would receive the territorial concessions which Jean had agreed to in London in 1358, being Calais, the county of Ponthieu, and an enlarged Duchy of Aquitaine. Ultimately, some of the terms of the Treaty of Bretigny would never be ratified. Specifically, Edward was reluctant to relinquish all his claims on the crown of France, and Jean II was reticent about removing all claims he had to suzerainty over the Duchy of Aquitaine. Yet the treaty was agreed to and would hold for nearly a whole decade. The treaty is typically seen as marking the conclusion of the first phase of the 100 Years' War. If one were to try to evaluate it in these terms, it would have to be concluded that the treaty signified a major victory for England in that same conflict and marked arguably the peak of Edward's reign. England's territorial possessions in France were greater as a result of the Treaty of Bretigny than they would be at any other point during the 100 Years' War. Clearly, then, the Peace of 1360 was a major victory for Edward and ensured that during the 1360s the English king could rest easy, knowing he was at the height of his powers in France and the Scottish border had been firmly secured, with the arrangement reached with David II in 1357. By comparison with the 3 decades which had preceded it, the 1360s were a comparatively tranquil period of Edward's reign. The Peace of Bretigny would last for nearly the whole of the 1360s, and, as a consequence, England enjoyed the first period of sustained peace of Edward III's long reign. Given the entirely advantageous footing the country was on by the time the first stage of the 100 Years' War ended in 1360, this was hardly an undesirable situation. On the domestic front, there were a number of important developments during these years. For example, in 1362, with the assent of Parliament, Edward set about reforming the wool staple, the mechanism whereby wool was exported out of England. The goal now was to set up a new staple at Calais for the export of wool to the continent through a single continental port. The initiative had considerable significance, as the English wool trade, arguably the country's greatest export commodity for the ensuing 3 centuries, was largely sold through markets in northern France and, above all, in the Low Countries, through the thriving mercantile centre of Antwerp. For many years to come, after the reform of the staple in the 1360s, in attempting to establish a staple at Calais, Edward was preempting the market demands of the 15th and 16th centuries. Yet, the most substantial domestic reform of the 1360s concerned the English language. When the Normans conquered England between 1066 and the early 1070s, they brought with them the French language and established it as the language of government and the law courts. During the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, a new language developed, a hybrid of Norman French and the Germanic tongue spoken by the Anglo-Saxons prior to the Norman conquest. This English language, known as Middle English, had become the common tongue of the English people by Edward III's reign, but French remained the language of the courts and government nonetheless. Edward attempted to overhaul this. In 1362, a statute of pleading was passed, which ordered English to be used in the law courts. Similarly, when Parliament met in 1363, the opening formalities were conducted in English rather than French for the first time. Consequently, the 1360s saw a number of important advances in the formal adoption of English as the language of government and the courts in England. Elsewhere, the 1360s were also an important period in the governance of the Lordship of Ireland. Because of the focus on France and Scotland during the majority of his reign, Edward had been unable to devote much time personally to Ireland, a country which the English crown ruled about half of in the east, north and south of the island. A number of Irish lordships ruled the western half of the country and continued to challenge the English rule there. Accordingly, in the early 1360s, Edward entrusted the governance of Ireland to his second eldest surviving son, Lionel of Clarence. This appointment bore significant fruit in the years that followed. In 1366, a parliament was held at the town of Kilkenny in the Irish Midlands, in which a series of statutes were promulgated to separate the English from the Irish in Ireland and protect the English parts of Ireland from Irish encroachments. The Statutes of Kilkenny, as they became known, would serve to insulate the English of Ireland from Irish cultural interference in the decades that followed. For instance, the statutes prohibited intermarriage between the Irish and English and put measures in place to prevent the English of Ireland from adopting Irish cultural and political customs. These measures substantially arrested any potential decline of English power in Ireland during the mid-14th century, and in one shape or another formed a major foundational basis of the English lordship of Ireland through to the early 16th century. While the 1360s was a relatively placid period of Edward's reign, the last decade in which he reigned, the 1370s, would bring with it fresh challenges, yet any assessment of Edward III's reign and his legacy must acknowledge that the king was not the central figure in the governance of the realm during the last 7 or 8 years of his reign. We first find references to Edward's health failing in 1369, when he was 57 years of age. He would live on for another 8 years, but there are clear indications that the king was suffering an increasing number of afflictions, both physical and mental, as the 1370s wore on. As with so many instances of illness in medieval monarchs, we cannot be entirely sure what Edward was actually suffering from during his last years, although it seems that the most serious of his maladies might have been caused by a series of strokes which he experienced in the last 8 or so years of his life. These afflictions certainly limited Edward's role in the governance of his realms, but he still played a part, though by the 1370s the day-to-day functions of government were increasingly carried out by his sons and extended family. Nevertheless, some significant events can be tied to Edward even in his final years. Paramount here was the resumption of the war in France. Peace had lasted for the better part of a decade since the settlement of 1360, but this was becoming more and more tenuous as the years went by. Charles V had succeeded his father Jean II as King of France in May 1364. The son was a more aggressive figure, who in the years that followed attempted to re-establish the strength of the French monarchy after the bruising it had taken during the 1340s and 1350s. For instance, he entered into a rapprochement with Charles of Navarre, the small kingdom on the southern border of France, but more conspicuously, the French king reasserted the suzerainty of the French monarchy over the Duchy of Brittany. The spark for renewed conflict with England came when Charles exploited internal unrest within the Duchy of Aquitaine in 1369 to demand that the Black Prince appear before him. When the heir to the English throne declined to do so, Charles V declared the Duchy of Aquitaine forfeit in an instant, reigniting the dormant 100 Years' War. In response, in the summer of 1369, Edward resumed his claim to the throne of France, which he had agreed to surrender in 1360. Consequently, the war was rejoined just as Edward's health was beginning to deteriorate at the end of the 1360s. This new chapter in the conflict between England and France was a fundamentally different affair to those of the 1340s and 1350s. For one thing, Edward would not lead an invasion of France himself, and the execution of the military campaigns was to be largely carried out by Edward's sons, the Black Prince and John of Gaunt. Notably, in this regard, Edward had intended to lead an expedition to France himself when the conflict first broke out in 1369, but he had to abandon his plans for this, and it was eventually John who commanded this army when it crossed the Channel. Moreover, in this new phase of the war, the conflict between England and France became increasingly mixed up, with a series of civil wars and interstate conflicts in Spain involving the two major powers there, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. It is perhaps a reflection on how much the victories of the 1340s and 1350s had been dependent on the dynamic leadership and brilliant generalship of Edward III that in this latest phase of the war, England floundered without the old king's direct involvement. Much of the Duchy of Aquitaine was overrun in the early 1370s, in part because the Castilians, with whom the French had allied, managed to defeat the English at sea off La Rochelle in southwestern France in June 1372. This defeat limited the degree to which English territories on the continent could be resupplied from England. A major campaign was undertaken in 1373 in an attempt to overturn the defeats which English arms had suffered between 1369 and 1372. This great chevauchée, or raid, was led by John of Gaunt and proceeded from Calais south through eastern France and then west to Bordeaux. Although it left much destruction in its wake, it was a strategic failure and failed in its main goal of reimposing English authority in Brittany. As a result, by the mid-1370s, without Edward's leadership to draw upon, the English position in France was much depleted and was largely confined to Calais in the north and the coastal regions of Gascony, including the town of Bordeaux. It was with the English fortunes at this low ebb that Pope Gregory XI offered to broker a peace between the belligerents in 1374. The resulting treaty, known as the Treaty of Bruges, was agreed on the 27th of June 1375. It allowed England time to regroup, but was unpopular at home in large part because the peace had seen the English position in the north of France weakened. Yet it would not last long. The issue of the sovereignty of the Duchy of Aquitaine was not resolved by this latest treaty, and in the months ahead this became a cause for fresh unrest. The English wanted Aquitaine to be freed entirely from French sovereignty, a move which would ensure that the kings of England would never have to pay homage to the monarchs of France again. While Charles V was somewhat understandably reluctant to effectively abandon any claim he had on the duchy, war would quickly resume again around this issue and several others in 1377. But when it did, it would be the task of the government of Edward's successor to oversee it. While the last years of Edward's reign saw some reverses in France, on the home front a number of domestic crises were navigated with admirable skill. These largely concerned the issue of financing a fresh period of war on the continent, and in 1371 and again in 1373, parliaments were called in order to obtain a loan and subsidy from the lords and gentry of England. In both instances, Edward had to make several concessions to the political nation in order to attain the requisite financing, notably by replacing a number of his senior ministers who were churchmen with lay officials. Yet resentment was building about the kingdom's finances throughout the decade, which came to a head in 1376 in a parliament convened just 1 year before Edward's death, known to history as the Good Parliament. This latest assembly was called to provide further financing for the crown. When it met in April 1376, however, it took advantage of the opportunity to lay forth a series of accumulated grievances, particularly with several of Edward's advisers. John of Gaunt also became a target of the Parliament, especially so during the summer of 1376, when the Black Prince died from dysentery on the 8th of June. A relatively amicable series of solutions were eventually worked out, whereby the councillors who had offended the political nation were dismissed and some further reforms implemented. Consequently, the end of Edward's life saw the English Parliament functioning as a means of redress for the English political community in a manner which would break down in later times. That this was avoided, and with it England spared any form of revolt during Edward's long reign, is a testament to the stability of his reign on the domestic front, despite the regular strains of financing extended wars in France and Scotland. However, that stability was fracturing. It would have been apparent to the assembled parliamentarians and nobles in London in 1376 that the king's health was deteriorating sharply. At the age of 64, and after nearly half a century on the English throne, in late September he became seriously ill from a large abscess. Days later, he was making some final amendments to his will in preparation for his impending death, but it did not come. Rather, the old monarch rallied in the weeks that followed. However, early in February 1377, the abscess burst. As a result, his movements were highly encumbered for the remaining months of his life. When he died at Sheen Palace, where Richmond Palace would subsequently be built, near London, on the 21st of June 1377, it was almost certainly from another stroke. He was 64 years of age. He died having achieved so much in his lifetime in a long and influential reign as England's monarch. The most significant chronicler of Edward's reign and the first half of the 100 Years' War, Jean Froissart, wrote stirringly of Edward's death and funeral in his chronicles, an event Froissart lived through himself. On the 21st of June 1377, the gallant and noble King Edward III departed this life, to the deep distress of the whole realm of England, for he had been a good king for them. His like had not been seen since the days of King Arthur, who once had also been King of England, which in his time was called Great Britain. King Edward was embalmed and placed with great pomp and reverence on a bier borne by 24 knights, dressed in black, his 3 sons and the Duke of Brittany and the Earl of March walking behind him, and carried thus at a slow march through the city of London, the face uncovered, to witness and hear the grief of the people. Their sobs and screams and lamentations on that day would have rendered anyone's heart. It was a fitting last journey for one of England's greatest kings. Edward was succeeded by his grandson Richard, the son of the Black Prince, just 10 years old at the time of his accession. Richard II would rule until he was usurped by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke in 1399. Richard's reign would be characterized by military reverses and mass social unrest within England, the most significant being the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. His reliance, like his great-grandfather Edward II, on a cohort of favourites, aroused widespread discontent throughout the Plantagenet realms and foreshadowed the Wars of the Roses of the 15th century. Consequently, Edward III's reign appears all the more remarkable in retrospect for having been an oasis of stability in the midst of the chaos that otherwise characterized England's politics throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. There is little doubting that Edward was one of England's most substantial and successful monarchs ever. In the 19th century, a generation of historians began to vilify the king and questioned whether his reign could be considered a success. However, this view is problematic, as the writers of the Victorian era attempted to impose their own value systems on the appraisal of Edward instead of assessing the king on his own terms as a late medieval monarch. For a king who was born and lived in warfare, the moral concerns of later generations would have made little sense. Indeed, imposing moral judgments on the actions of people who lived hundreds of years ago is always problematic. More recently, historians such as Ian Mortimer and William Ormrod have successfully restored Edward III's reputation. While there is no denying that Edward's last years saw some setbacks, particularly in France, he was at this time very ill, and power had largely devolved to his sons. When we disregard this latter period, there is no doubting the success of Edward's reign. Under his rule, England reached the peak of its power during the medieval period. At points between the 1330s and 1360s, Edward was not just the ruler of England, Wales, and much of Ireland, but was able to impose his authority fairly thoroughly on Scotland and large sections of northern and western France. Some of the territorial gains were either permanent, as in the case of Berwick on the Anglo-Scottish border, or long-lasting, as in the case of the town of Calais in northern France. The 100 Years' War, which he initiated, was a key component in the eventual formation of England and France into modern nation-states, owing to the manner in which it drew on their administrative and financial resources and fostered a fledgling sense of patriotism through national endeavour. Indeed, when Edward sent requests for men and money around his dominions to fund his campaigns in France, he was effectively commanding his local officials to come up with better ways of taxing the country and exploiting its resources. This is the very basis of the modern nation-state, one which is expertly placed to exploit the resources available to it to the maximum extent possible in the name of government. Much of this territorial expansion was achieved on the back of both Edward's outstanding abilities as a general and the military revolution which he oversaw during his rule. The English longbow made England the military superpower of its day. At Halidon Hill, Crécy, Neville's Cross, Poitiers, and several other battles, English armies consistently managed to defeat French and Scottish armies, which were substantially numerically superior to those commanded by Edward and his nobles. Moreover, an English army was quite possibly the first to utilize field cannon in all of Europe at Crécy in 1346. Nor was Edward's military prowess confined to land. As at Sluys in 1340, Edward demonstrated how effective the English longbow could be, even at sea. Given all this, there is little doubting that Edward III should be viewed as one of the great commanders of English and British military history, a figure who stands alongside John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, whose command of England's forces during the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century catapulted England to the rank of major powers in Europe, or perhaps even Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, whose successful prosecution of the Peninsular War in Portugal and Spain, which took place between 1807 and 1814, became the bane of Napoleon's dominance of Europe, while Wellington was also central to Bonaparte's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. Certainly, Edward III's legacy as a military commander probably surpasses his grandfather Edward I, while he may not have been able to convert his military victories as successfully into political victories. There is little doubting Edward III was a more skilled commander on the field of battle. Edward's legacy should not just be measured through assessing his prowess on the battlefield. In the late 1340s, he established the Order of the Garter, England's highest chivalric order to this day, and in doing so contributed to England being considered the most chivalrous kingdom in Western Europe at the height of the Middle Ages. As a further statement to the world of his rule, he also re-edified and expanded Windsor Castle as a symbol of English royal power. Another lasting achievement was seen in the late 1340s and early 1350s, when Edward successfully steered England through the crisis wrought by the arrival of the bubonic plague in Europe. The Black Death was the greatest crisis faced by Europe during the late Middle Ages. Perhaps as much as a third of England's population died within the space of half a decade, but rather than succumbing psychologically to the onslaught of illness and death which ravaged England in the late 1340s, Edward guided the country through this period by stabilizing the economy through the passage of the Statute of Labourers, moreover in strengthening the office of the Justice of the Peace. In order to effectively implement the statute on the local level in England, Edward's government made a lasting contribution to English local administration, one which was subsequently exported to Ireland, North America, India, and Australia in later centuries. Yet, in many other ways, Edward's reign and its success was about long-term nation-building. Parliament became more important during his reign, and he began to use many of the emblems which came to symbolize England itself, notably carrying the cross of St George into battle. But perhaps Edward's greatest legacy was in the reorientation of the courts and government to favour Middle English as the language of government and officialdom in England. As a result, in the centuries that followed, when England and then Britain began settling colonies elsewhere all over the world, it was English which was spread globally as the language of England and Britain. There is no doubting the importance of Edward III to all these key developments of the 14th century, making him perhaps England's greatest king. What do you think of King Edward III? Was he England's greatest ever king, and if so, is he unjustly forgotten about today? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.